Chapter 1042. At the entrance of the academy, the young Baldy looked at the man and said indifferently, "You will attend this class with them. If you can pass the exam for this class, then you can leave. If you can't pass, then you can only eat steamed buns and drink water today. If you can't pass today, then in the next 2 days, you will have to pass 2 more exams." The man was stunned. Like most of the people here, he had never been to school and didn't know a word. When he heard the old man shaking his head and talking, he dozed off. He didn't even know how to hold a brush. What kind of exam was this? He just peed. Was there a need to be like this? He pursed his lips, looked at the bald man and asked, "What if I still can't pass tomorrow?" "If you still can't pass." The bald man patted him on the shoulder and comforted him. In fact, steamed buns and plain water are the most nourishing. Although Commander Wang usually treated people kindly, many people were still afraid of him when he was serious. Not long after, the man walked into the school dejectedly and sat in the last row. The young bald man went forward and said a few words to the old teacher. The old man nodded and glanced at the back row. He didn't care about the man anymore. The man sat in the back row. When he saw the eyes of the children around him, his face was a little red. He simply lay on the table and slept. He really didn't believe that Boss Wang was crazy to let him sit in the school with these little children to study. Did he want him to be the top scorer? He, Wang Dezhuang, was not meant to be a scholar in his life. Listening to the old man's voice, he felt sleepy. After an unknown amount of time, he was pushed awake by a little fat man sitting next to him. The little fat man handed him a piece of paper and a pen and said, "The teacher said to write down the 5 words he just taught." The man looked at him with a dull face. Before writing it down, he needed to know what words the old man had taught him, how to write those words and how to hold the pen. He looked at the little fat man, smiled and said, "How about you write one for me? I'll go out and buy you candied hawthorn. My family sells candied hawthorn." The little fatty looked at him and shook his head. "Also, teacher said that I can't write for him or I'll be punished too." The man looked at him helplessly. "Then can you at least copy it for me?" "Not giving." The little fatty replied bluntly. He turned his back to her and began to write on his own. The man grabbed the brush and looked at the white paper on the table. His face was lifeless and he didn't know what to write. After a while, the pen in front of him disappeared and so did the paper. In its place was a cup of water, a steamed bun and a bald head. The baldy looked at him and said, "Tomorrow is a poetry recitation test. The day after tomorrow is poetry recitation. The day after that you might have to learn arithmetic. The commander said that the 5 words that you didn't write today have to be filled in. Take care." With that he turned around and left. The man sat in his original position in a daze, reciting poems, writing from memory, calculating. They wanted him dead. The man shuddered and hurriedly ran out. He didn't see the baldy, but he saw the little fatty who stopped him from copying. The little fatty was licking a stick of candied hawthorn. The man snatched it from his hand and took a bite. He threatened, "Kid, write one for me tomorrow or I'll beat you up." The little fatty didn't cry or make a fuss when his candied hawthorn was snatched away. He just turned around and looked at an 8 feet tall muscular man behind him. He said, "Dad, he snatched my candied hawthorn and wanted to beat me up." A shadow suddenly appeared in front of the man. He raised his head and looked at the man who was much more muscular than him. He trembled and said, "Big brother, it's a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding my ass." It was much cooler in the mountains than outside, but there were more mosquitoes. Li Yi and Drunken Mo couldn't compare to Rui and Rui. The mosquitoes would avoid them, so he could only make a few mosquito traps. Fortunately, they were very effective. Mississippi Lu stayed in the mountains for a few days before she went out with the Lu Meng's men. It seemed that she was going to sweep through the entire fringe. The fringe was actually very vast. They had only opened a trade route from the Qi Kingdom to the Jing Kingdom, cleared all the hidden dangers around the trade route, and had just started to advance to the periphery. Mississippi Lu set her sights on the entire fringe. Not only did she want to be the ruler of the New World, she also wanted to be the ruler of all the mountains in the fringe. What Li Yi needed to do was to stabilize the rear, provide her with strategic support, resources, and be the man behind the scenes. On a hidden mountain, Li Yi looked at the rows of towering buildings in front of him. Once again he felt that Wang Wei was quite reliable. He had an entire library in his mind. He could do so many things with it. He could create many things that were considered black technology in this world, but he was only one person and he was lazy. If he really wanted to accomplish these things, he would need to live for 500 years and then borrow another 500 years from God. Perhaps a few hundred years would not be enough. Even if he had a lifetime of hundreds or thousands of years, it would still be impossible to bring out all the knowledge in his mind. Things like the technology tree should be left to Li Xian. He couldn't even handle Rui, so he had no interest in these things, but he didn't really want to waste his hard-earned cheat. After all, other than copying books, poems, and peeking at other people's diaries, this thing still had other uses. Li Yi asked Wang Wei to open up an industrial area far away from the village. They would conduct research on things like iron smelting, coke making, and forging. Although it was called research, it was actually just him telling them to do it. These would be very useful in the future. Although they couldn't use it for now, it was better to be prepared. For the time being, this would be the breakthrough point. The rest would be developed slowly in the future. At the back of the classroom. In the corner of the back row, a man looked at the little fatty beside him and swallowed his saliva. He watched as the little fatty chewed on the chicken drumstick in his hand and said, "Little brother, when you come tomorrow, can you secretly bring me some salted vegetables?" He had been eating steamed buns and drinking plain water for 7 days. He had lost a lot of weight, and the reason for all this was because he had peed outside the toilet. He couldn't understand it now. The toilet was clean and tidy, and there was no smell after he flushed it. Why did he have to pee outside? This was despicable. The little fatty nodded with great difficulty. He immediately picked up a pen and pointed at a word on the paper with the tip of the pen. He asked, "Little brother, how do I pronounce this word? I've forgotten. Can you teach me again?" He felt extremely miserable. The school was really too scary. Even if he were to move stones outside, it would be better than sitting here and reading. The detention room not far from the school had also been transformed into a new school. In the past month, people who urinated, spat, and did not pay attention to hygiene were all caught and brought here. Here they didn't have to move stones, pave bridges, or repair roads. They didn't have to do anything. They could spend their days swimming in the sea of knowledge, experiencing the joy of reading. Haha, I passed. I can go out now. Suddenly, a person rushed out from inside and stood on the street looking like a madman. After laughing, he looked down at his hands with a pained expression. These were a pair of hands used to chop people, but they had been used to write for the past few days. He wrote non-stop all night, and if he couldn't finish, he could only eat steamed buns and drink plain water. He wasn't even given a salted vegetable. Suddenly, a few hands reached out from the window. Someone exhorted loudly, brother, come back. Stay for another 2 days and teach us too." That person stood on the street and laughed maniacally. "Even if I die outside, starve to death, suffocate to death, or jump off the mountain to my death, I won't go back." In a room somewhere in the stronghold, Commander Wang touched his bald head. He was surprised to find that in the entire stronghold, there hadn't been a case of people urinating, spitting, and littering everywhere for a long time. In the short span of half a month, this problem that had been troubling him for years had actually been cured. Chapter 1043. The group of people who were used to using the sky as their blanket and the earth as their bed, and eating, drinking, and defecating on the bed suddenly became particular. No one peed or spat on the ground anymore. The village looked brand new. Wang Wei was once again impressed by His Royal Highness Jianghu of Silla's wisdom. Setting up a school in the stockade was indeed useful. In the past, he had thought that it was superfluous. Now, it seemed that people who had been educated were indeed different. Those guys had only been in the school for a short period of time, but they had already become civilized and polite. When his child was born and grew up, he would also send him to the school and let the teacher teach him well. Li also heard about this from Wang Wei. He felt a little regretful. His subordinates were a group of boorish men. They would pick up a knife and cut people without hesitation, but when he asked them to pick up a pen and write, it was like asking for their lives. He gave them a free chance to improve themselves and surpass themselves, but none of them cherished it. Ning Yuan was unwilling to go back to the school even if he moved stones to build bridges and roads. This made it impossible to implement the other ideas that Fang gave him. For example, they could be confined for half a month and sent food and water every day, but there was no toilet in the confinement room. Anyway, they were used to doing it on the spot. Another idea was to erect a monument in front of the village and engrave their names and heroic deeds on it for future generations to admire. Or, forget it, it was too disgusting, no more examples. No one was willing to study. Even if they had to hold their urine to death outside, they were unwilling to go back to the school. Perhaps they had already realized that there was no end to learning and that it was still possible to repent. But this also exposed a major problem. He was very short of high-end talents under his command. Just look at Second Miss Liu in the past and you can see how much martial artists despised reading, not to mention those bandits. To put it bluntly, they were just a bunch of unruly people. They could swarm up and shout to kill, and they had some strength in repairing bridges and roads. However, when it came to management or charging and breaking through enemy lines according to rules, they were far from being good at it. This was not what Li Yi wanted to see, nor was it what Mississippi Lu wanted to see. Mississippi Lu had left half a month ago to occupy more mountains. Before she left some of Lu Meng's people here to train Wang Wei's men. If it wasn't for the fact that life was really tough, no one would be willing to become a bandit. Many people were ordinary people before they became bandits, and they also had families to support them. After being subdued, some of them relied on their own efforts to earn a family business and brought their families here. Now this place was no different from an ordinary town. Li Yi selected a group of people who were educated and tried to cultivate some talents in other fields. Currently he focused on industrial fields such as machinery and materials. Of course he didn't need them to come into contact with advanced things. As long as he explained some simple theories, they would be able to understand and put them into practice. At this time he started to miss Li Xian. The real talents that he needed were almost all in the Academy of Sciences. He still had to poach some people from his side. "Your Highness, it's done." Wang Wei strode in from outside with a pile of swords and knives in his hands. He threw them on the ground with a clatter. Li Yi stood up and walked to the front. Wang Wei picked up 2 knives from the ground and held them in his hands. He said, "Your Highness, look. This is an ordinary knife and this one was just made by them." He waved both his hands at the same time. With a clang, sparks flew everywhere. The knife in his right hand was undamaged, but the one in his left hand had an obvious chip. Clang. He slashed twice again. The knife in his left hand broke into 2 pieces, but the one in his right hand was still intact. Fang, who had just walked in from outside, stared at the knife in Wang Wei's hand. His eyes lit up and he muttered, "Treasure, treasure." Wang Wei looked at him and said generously, "You like it? If you like it, I'll give it to you." He handed the knife to Fang, but Fang did not take it. A hint of vigilance appeared on his face and he said, "What do you want?" "I can't afford to offend that tigress of yours. You didn't play cards with me yesterday. You'd better find another reason to fool her." "Oh, I didn't go back. What reason do I need? I'm not you even afraid of your wife. If you have the guts, say this again in front of her later. Why should I listen to you?" Li Yi ignored these 2 guys who were unwilling to admit the truth. He picked up the 2 swords from the ground and carefully examined them. After the improvement of the smelting and forging methods, the quality of the steel had indeed improved a lot. Although it was still far from the level of cutting through iron like mud, compared to ordinary weapons, it could already be called a treasure. Since it was a treasure, it could be sold for money, a lot of money. He was already very rich, but he had so many subordinates who needed to eat, invest in construction, and support his squandering sister-in-law Rui. When it came to things like money, the more the better. Rui's autumn water was a good sword. In terms of sharpness and toughness, it was not comparable to the one in his hand. However, that sword must have been forged by a skilled master craftsman after thousands of tempering. Although it could be sold for a very good price, the cost was not low. Mass production was different. The technological reform and cost reduction allowed them to easily create divine weapons in the eyes of ordinary people. This was not a divine weapon, it was all money. In the Jing kingdom, the richest people were in the capital. In the Qi kingdom, the richest people were in the capital. After pondering for a moment, Li Yi felt that it was time to let those foreign merchants from the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland out. No, I almost forgot. After the incident with Lioli, whether in the Qi kingdom or the Jing kingdom, if those foreign merchants dared to show up, they would be caught and dismembered immediately. This time he changed the method. He sat down at the table again and began to write to Li Xian. Hibiscus Garden, the capital. Li Xian held a dagger in his hand. He easily cut a few holes in the long saber of the opposite guard. He nodded with a satisfied look on his face. After sending so many gifts, that stingy guy finally knew to return the favor. This dagger was not bad. It was extremely sharp and exceptionally tough. Even the treasures in the palace could not compare to it. Could be called a divine weapon. It could be said that he was considerate. However, he soon realized a problem. This dagger was forged by him. In other words, he had mastered a new forging method. He did not tell me. I have done everything for him, but he kept it from me. There was a look of indignation on his face. If it were not for the heavenly weapon, he would not have ordered for him to find the best blacksmith in the Jing kingdom. At some point, the guard behind him bowed slightly. "Greetings, Your Highness." 2 women walked side by side from afar. The younger one on the left looked at him and asked, "Brother, did Sir send another letter?" Li Xian looked at Shanning, who had completely lost her innocence and naivety. He smiled and said, "Not only did he send a letter, come and take a look at this." He showed off the sharpness of the dagger in front of Mingzu and Shanning. He said in a boastful tone, "Although this dagger is a little short in terms of sharpness, even the treasures in the palace could not compare to it. It can be called a priceless divine weapon." After saying that, he seemed to have thought of something. He pointed behind him and said, "He brought you a gift too. Go open it." The two women walked over slowly and opened the two long brocade boxes on the table behind him. After being stunned for a while, they turned their heads at the same time and looked at the dagger in Li Xian's hand. Li Xian was stunned. He then smiled and said, "If you like this divine weapon, I can lend it to you for a few days. But remember to return it to me. I still need to use it for research." Shanning closed the brocade box discreetly. She shook her head and said, "It's fine, you're welcome. I will ask him to give you two next time." Li Xian walked over and asked in confusion, "What did he give you?" "It's nothing." Shanning shook her head and picked up the brocade box. She said, "Brother, I still have something to do in the academy. I will leave first." The brocade box was too long. It was at least 4 feet long. When she turned around, she accidentally knocked over the other one. The box landed on the ground. When the lid was opened, the thing inside the box was revealed. It was a long sword. The sword was more than 3 feet long. The hilt of the sword was carved into a lifelike phoenix. The scabbard was carved with complicated patterns. It was unusually exquisite. There was also a row of more than 10 jewels inlaid on it. Under the illumination of the sun, it shone brightly. Li Xian was stunned. He lowered his head and picked up the sword. He seemed to have thought of something. He unsheathed the sword and waved it at the wooden table beside him. Crack! A white light flashed. The wooden table was split into two and fell to the side. He looked at the long sword in his hand and the short dagger in his other hand. One was more than 3 feet long and the other was less than 1 foot long. One of the scabbard was exquisite and inlaid with jewels. It was priceless. The other one did not have a scabbard. It was sent in a wooden box. He suddenly felt a little sad. Chapter 1044. In Jianghu, when the imperial guards of the palace pasted the imperial notices on the city gates and various streets and alleys in conspicuous places, commoners quickly surrounded them. In the early years, it was rare to see imperial notices posted. When the former emperor was on the throne, he only pasted one when he searched for famous doctors to treat a certain princess in the palace. Later, when the current emperor opened a mathematics school, he often posted notices like this to search for craftsmen among the commoners. By now, the commoners were no longer surprised by this. A scholar who passed by had already deciphered the contents of the imperial notice, causing a lot of discussion among the people. This time, the emperor wanted to recruit skilled blacksmiths from all over the Jing kingdom. It was said that food, accommodation, and women would be provided. Those with families would also be given a courtyard in the capital. Apart from that, they would also receive a monthly subsidy from the country. If they were a famous master blacksmith, they might even be able to get a position in the Academy of Sciences. From then on, they would be able to bring glory to their family, reach the sky in a single step, and make their ancestors proud. In short, as long as one had a skill, one would be able to live a good life in the capital city in the Jing kingdom. Even if one was an old farmer, as long as his land was better than others and his harvest was greater than others, there would still be some officials from the Academy of Sciences who would be willing to call him teacher and humbly ask him questions. A scholar in a green robe looked at the imperial notice posted on the city wall, then looked at the book he had just bought and sighed. The book in his hand was this year's imperial examination secret scroll, which he had spent a lot of money and pulled a lot of strings to buy. A blacksmith could get food, accommodation, and marriage services. It was a pity that he had not passed the imperial examination. At the age of coronation, he had not married and had not even touched a woman's hand. It was not that he had not touched a woman's hand. Yesterday when he was buying vegetables, the auntie who sold vegetables had touched him. Thinking of this, he could not help but feel sad. He threw the book in his hand to the ground and strode away. 10 years of studying hard could not compare to 10 years of forging iron. What was the use of reading such a useless book? After a few steps he turned around and walked back. He picked up the book on the ground, patted the dust off it, and carefully put it in his pocket. He still had to study. Even if he didn't pass the exam, he would become a blacksmith in the future. Between a blacksmith who had studied and a blacksmith who only knew how to forge iron, there was no need to even think about whose future was brighter. What's more, this thing cost a lot of money. Blacksmith Su was an ordinary blacksmith in the capital. He originally had a name, but his neighbors had been calling him Blacksmith Sue, or Blacksmith Sue for decades. He couldn't remember how long it had been since someone last mentioned his real name. He had just come back from the city wall, so naturally he had heard the latest news. The spring of blacksmiths that he had been looking forward to was finally here. Carpenter Wang, who lived next door, had entered the Academy of Sciences 2 years ago. Although he was only doing odd jobs for the great craftsman of the Ministry of Works, he had built a 2-story courtyard this year and arranged a marriage for his silly son. The bride was going to be married this year, and his life was enviable. The old gangster who sold pornography diagonally across the street was also living a comfortable life because he could tell what people were saying just by looking at their lips. It was said that he was a teacher at the Academy of Sciences and had a group of disciples. He even boasted that he had taught the current emperor. Blacksmith Sue's son was still young, so he wasn't in a hurry to arrange a marriage for him. As a blacksmith, he didn't have the extravagant hope of becoming a teacher for the emperor. All he wanted was to earn more money and let his family of 3 live a more comfortable life. He glanced at his son who was playing outside the door. He didn't forge iron, but leaned comfortably on the chair and took a sip of the good wine that he had just bought from the tavern. He had already signed up for the recruitment on the imperial notice board, and now he just had to wait for the notification. Outside the door, a few young children were running happily in the streets. Eat my wind god's kick. I know the cloud-splitting palm. I have the snow-guzzling saber. I have the peerless sword. The world of children was always carefree. They weren't old enough to study, so they only thought about eating and playing every day. Sometimes they would sneak into the brothel to listen to stories. The brothel was the most magical place in their hearts. There were monkeys waving sticks and fighting their way up to the 33 levels of heaven. There were various immortals and gods that they had never heard of. There were also many martial arts masters and heroic deeds of chivalrous heroes. After listening to stories in the brothel, they would play the roles they liked and reenact the stories they had heard. It was a game that they never got tired of. They were acting out a new story in the brothel, which was the plot of Wind and Cloud. Wind god's kick, cloud-splitting palm, snow-guzzling saber, and the peerless sword, each of them had a dream of being a hero. They wanted to learn the peerless martial arts and help the weak, punish the weak, and fight the evil in the martial world. That was what the story said. Of course, since he was a chivalrous hero, he needed a suitable weapon, a martial art move that sounded powerful, and a fine horse. The horse had to be beautiful, and it would be best if it was tall and big. Only then would Squire Zhang's son Zhang Xiaohua ride the same horse as him. Zhang Xiaohua lived in Zhang Yuanwai's house. He didn't have a horse or a weapon. He didn't know where the sword-worshipping villa that the old grandpa mentioned was. It was said that there were many peerless godly weapons there. If he could get one, brother, don't be angry. Playing with the dagger in her hand, Shaning looked at Li Xian and said, Master once said that simplicity is beauty. Look at this dagger. It's simple and clean. The scabbard is simple and the curve of the blade is smooth. Simplicity was beauty. Li Xian naturally understood this principle. However, when Shaning comforted him, she couldn't walk back and forth. She was holding the long sword in her other hand, and the gem on the scabbard was shining so brightly that he couldn't open his eyes. Looking at her serious expression, Li Xian asked, How about we exchange? Shaning was dazed and said in surprise, But brother, this sword is for women. I don't mind. Li Xian looked at her and said, You can have the simple and beautiful dagger. Brother, are you serious? Yes. I won't exchange. After saying that, the pretty woman turned around and left. She walked out of the hall and did not look back even once. Li Xian sat back down and looked at the dagger on the table angrily. He had thought that it was a unique godly weapon. It was indeed unique. Among the 3 gifts he gave, this was the most special, simple and shabby one, the shortest. He knew that he wouldn't compete with Mingzu to avoid humiliating himself. But Shaning. Thinking of the girl just now, forget it, Shaning wouldn't compete with him. He would still be humiliating himself. Thinking of this, he actually felt a little better. Then he opened another letter. Sword Greeting Villa, a batch of peerless godly weapons. After reading the letter, he had a rough idea of what Li Yi wanted to do. If he was a shepherd, then the officials and nobles in the capital were the fat sheep raised by his family. A few years ago he used the colored glass to make these fat sheep shed a layer of wool. Now that new wool had grown, he was here again. He was the emperor, and those people were his subjects. Although it was easy for them to make money, he couldn't let him fool them again and again. If it weren't for the fact that the Academy of Sciences had several big projects that needed funding, if it weren't for the fact that his second child was about to be born, If it weren't for the fact that Emmingse didn't allow him to squander the money in the national treasury, he would never agree to Li Yi doing this. He walked out of the door and said to a guard, "Tell them that 280 is not enough, at least 370. At the gate of the capital, several carriages came from afar. Before they entered the city, they were stopped by the guards at the gate. One of the generals came forward and asked, "What's in the carriages?" A man smiled and said, "Some goods." "What goods?" The general lifted the black cloth covering the carriages and opened a box. After taking a look, his expression changed. He opened a few more boxes and his expression darkened. He took a few steps back and waved his hand. Seeing this, the guards behind him immediately surrounded the carriages. Only then did the general come forward and ask, "Do you have the seal of the imperial court?" Smuggling weapons was a serious crime, not to mention that there were so many of them. If they didn't have the seal of the imperial court, these people had to be arrested and interrogated immediately. "Of course we do." The leader nodded and took out something that looked like a piece of silk from his sleeve and handed it over. After carefully examining it, the general waved his hand and the guards behind him left. The carriages drove through the gate. The general was still a little worried and went forward to ask, "Where did these things come from?" In front of the carriages, the man turned around and said with a smile, "Sword Greeting Villa." Chapter 1045. There were two markets in the capital, the east and the west, selling a wide variety of goods. It was the largest market in the vicinity of the Jing kingdom. Of course, apart from the row upon row of shops and the endless stalls on the streets, there were also all kinds of strange things. For example, a chicken with 3 legs, a bird without legs, a stone man with words on its body, a fox that could talk, and so on. Of course, the imperial court did not allow foxes to talk, and the people were not allowed to dig stones from the river. However, there were still people who laid a piece of white cloth in a corner of the street and sold some valuable antiques that were unknown whether they were real or fake. There were rich people in the capital, and there were also rich people who were interested in these things. The capital's West Market. After the market opened at dawn, the shouting continued until the market closed at night. Glazed statue blessed by Master Sandalwood, 5 taels of silver for 1. The chair that His Highness Jianghu of Silla sat on, 100 taels of silver. Selling a knife. A treasured knife passed down from my ancestors, able to cut copper, iron, gold, and jade. The original price is 10,000 taels, now only 5,000 taels, only 5,000 taels. There were all kinds of things for sale on the streets of the capital. A while ago, someone was selling underwear worn by His Highness Jianghu of Silla. Later, it was confirmed that it was not Jianghu of Silla, and the seller was arrested and sent to prison for fraud. Sometimes, the people would gather around to watch the excitement, to see what was so special about the chair that His Highness Jianghu of Silla sat on, to see if the Buddha statue blessed by Master Sandalwood would glow, to see if the treasured knife passed down from my ancestors could cut iron like mud, and so on. A man with a long knife at his waist walked up to the man selling the knife and asked, "This knife of yours, is it really as good as you say?" The man smiled, "A treasured knife is a treasured knife. In front of everyone, if I lie to you, I'll give you 5,000 taels of silver for free." Hearing this, the man smiled, drew out the long knife at his waist and said, "This knife of mine is just an ordinary one, you can try." The man also drew out the knife in his hand, handed it to him and said, "You can try it yourself." The man looked at him and suddenly said warily, "If I break this saber, you won't ask me to pay for it, right?" "How could that be?" The man shook his head and pointed at the crowd. "Today everyone here is a witness. If my family's treasured saber is broken by this brother, I don't need him to compensate." Seeing this, the man no longer hesitated. He held 2 sabers in each hand and chopped down. Clang. After the sound of metal clashing, the saber that he brought with him broke, but the man's family heirloom saber was not damaged in the slightest. He stared blankly at the broken blade on the ground with a pained expression on his face. He then looked at the man and said, "How dare you sell weapons privately and break my family heirloom? I'm going to arrest you and bring you to the authorities." The Jing kingdom was very strict with the control of weapons. Without the permission of the government, it was illegal to sell weapons. Of course, the regulations in this area had always been very lax. However, if it was investigated carefully, the man's act of selling knives on the street had indeed violated the law. The man looked at the big man who was stunned on the spot and said, "It's fine if I don't arrest you unless you compensate me with this knife." The man who sold the saber snatched back the saber and grabbed the man to beat him up. Some of the crowd stayed to watch while others shook their heads and left. Recently, there were many people selling ancestral treasured sabers and swords on the street. A few days ago there were even people selling snowguzzler sabers and peerless swords. They had heard too many stories in the brothel and were obsessed. This man actually knew how to use the trick of injuring himself to gain the confidence of others. It was a pity that his appetite was too big. If it was really a divine weapon it would be worth it. However, there was a 90% chance that it was just a clumsy scam. Among the people who stayed, some of them could not help but come forward to verify it. The man was quite generous and seemed to be very confident in his family heirloom saber. He did not refuse anyone and looked very confident. Gradually, people were surprised to find that this saber seemed to be really unusual. When ordinary sabers came into contact with it, they would either break in two or be cut. Although it could not be said to be able to cut iron like mud, it could really be regarded as a treasured saber. This kind of divine weapon was very popular in the martial arts world. Many rich families in the capital also liked to collect them. In the crowd, a man who looked like a servant looked at the man and said, "The one selling the saber, take your saber and follow me." "All right." The man's face lit up. He immediately put away the saber and followed the servant into a big house. The crowd knew that this man's saber had caught someone's eye. This 5,000 taels of silver was a little too easy to obtain. When the crowd dispersed, another voice came from the crowd. "What family heirloom saber? Didn't you buy it? Didn't you see that the saber is brand new?" "Nonsense, this kind of divine weapon must have been made by a master. How could an ordinary shop buy it? It's the newly opened shop in front. It's called Sword Greeting Villa. It said that the signboard was personally inscribed by His Majesty. You will know once you take a look. A new weapon shop called Sword Greeting Villa opened in the capital. All the weapons sold were divine weapons. Moreover, the signboard was personally inscribed by His Majesty. It was a guarantee of credibility. A big signboard was erected in front of the shop. Limited stock, first come, first served. The sabers and swords in the shop were all first-rate divine weapons. They were famous for being peerless swords, hero's sword, blazing Qilin sword, snow guzzle saber. Someone came because of the shop's reputation. He used a random saber in the shop to clash with a famous saber made by a master. In the end, the famous saber was chipped while the other was undamaged. Once the news spread, the entire capital was in an uproar. In just a few days, the name Sword Greeting Villa spread throughout the capital. According to the story in the brothel, Sword Greeting Villa had the world's best swordsmithing technique. They could forge divine weapons that could cut through iron like it was mud. Originally, people thought that this was just a made-up story. Now, it seemed that this story was not completely a story. For a period of time, countless nobles and officials who loved collecting rare treasures swarmed over, and the martial artists who longed to own a peerless divine weapon could no longer sit still. It was said that even the current emperor had bought a few of them. In less than 3 days, all the weapons in Sword Greeting Villa were sold out. Even so, there was still an endless stream of people coming to ask about it every day. In the capital, when the door of Sword Greeting Villa was about to be trampled by people, in the faraway Shu state, in the chaotic land, Li Yi was peeling an apple for Zuamo. Peeling an apple with an ordinary knife was fine. Using a peerless sword to peel an apple would be too conspicuous, and it would easily hurt his hand. After peeling the apple, he wanted to feed it to her personally. Coincidentally, Ruoqing and Rui went in, so he was chased out. Li Yi felt that he was not very popular now. Sometimes Rui would sleep with Zuamo, and sometimes Ruoqing would sleep with Zuamo. Sometimes the three of them would sleep together as if he was the only extra. So be it. Having a harmonious family was much better than having a harem on fire. What else could he be dissatisfied with? Li Yi took a bite of the apple, walked back to his room and picked up a document. Although they were now able to mass-produce the divine weapons in the eyes of the world, there were too many people under them. For a long time, the supply would not be able to meet the demand. Of course, good things should be equipped for their own people first. Except for the batch that was transported to the capital, there was no outflow for the time being. 2 days ago, Li Xian had sent a letter saying that 100 skilled blacksmiths were already on their way. There were too many people who had signed up, so he had even conducted a selection test to select the best 100 blacksmiths and send them over. Li Yi wanted these blacksmiths not only to forge swords. In terms of smelting and forging, they were definitely much better than these laymen. He also hoped that they could take a big step from theory to practice and come up with something more practical. Halfway through eating the apple, he looked up and saw Fang walking over from a distance. His face was a little ugly. He looked at Li Yi and said, "Young master, there is news from the Wu Kingdom, there is news from the Wu Kingdom." Chapter 1046. For the sake of Mississippi Lu's precious disciple, Li Yi had sent people to the Wu Kingdom to gather information a long time ago. During this period of time, news came in one after another. They were all about the stalemate between the forces loyal to the late emperor and the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom. It was neither good nor bad, however, judging from Fang's current expression, it could not be anything good. Li Yi took a letter from him, opened it and looked at it. The letter said that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom had secretly recruited several rebel forces. Half a month ago, they besieged Princess Duanrong who had rebelled. In that battle, the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom won a complete victory. Princess Duanrong's side suffered a crushing defeat. The imperial court reclaimed all the cities they had seized. As for Princess Duanrong, her whereabouts were still unknown. Unknown meant that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom had not found her. This was the silver lining in the misfortune. Li Yi looked at Fang and asked, "Does Rui know about this?" Rui was not in the stockade. She had returned a few days ago. She should still be busy subduing the other forces in the fringe. Fang nodded and said, "I've already sent someone to deliver the news. She should know soon." Li Yi rubbed the space between his brows and said helplessly, "Go find her. Immediately." Second Miss Lu had become a lot gentler. She wouldn't retaliate even if she was spanked. She was like a completely different person from before. However, there was something else in her character that wouldn't change easily. Back then, she had traveled thousands of miles to find her brother-in-law. She had chased him from the capital to Shuzhou, then from Shuzhou to the Qi Kingdom. She had rescued him from the hands of Taoist nun. After learning that Yang Liuking's fate was unknown, she might have run from the fringe to the Wu Kingdom to find her only disciple. If he and Rui were not by her side, no one could stop her. Li Yi did not object to Rui's search for Yang Liuking. After all, she was already half a member of the Li family after spending so much time together. Just based on the fact that she called him martial aunt, Li Yi would not sit idly by and watch her get into trouble. He and Rui did not blame her for leaving without saying goodbye. She had too many burdens on her shoulders, such as the hatred of her country and family. Even so, she did not bend her spine. It could only be said that Rui had an incredible disciple and he had an incredible martial nephew. But no matter how many experts the Lu alliance had, no matter how good their weapons were, they would not be able to fight against the country. So he needed to stop Rui in time when she was impulsive, so that he could make a long-term plan. After saying goodbye to Rui and the others, Li Yi, Fang and Su set off immediately. There was no need to bring too many people. The elites and core disciples of the alliance were by Rui's side. Fang was there to watch the fun, and Su was there to deal with all kinds of unexpected situations. He only hoped that when they arrived, Mississippi Lu would not be so impulsive. In the Wu Kingdom. In the imperial capital. A eunuch gently knocked on the door of a luxurious palace and pushed it open. Inside the palace there were bookshelves on both sides, and the bookshelves were densely packed with books. Right in front of them was a table, and behind the table sat a figure. The eunuch bowed to the ground and asked respectfully, "Your Majesty, those rebels have arrived in the imperial capital. General Qing asked me to ask your Majesty, how should we deal with them?" The figure behind the table put down the book in his hand and said, "Since they are rebels, General Qing should know how to deal with them. There's no need to ask me about such a small matter." "Yes. Your servant will reply to General Qing now. Your servant will take his leave." The eunuch bowed again and was about to turn around and leave. "Is there any news about Qing and Fu? Before he walked out of the palace, the figure behind the table spoke again. The eunuch turned around and bowed again. "Your Majesty, General Qing said that this time, we will definitely deal with these two rebels." "Shut up." A reprimanding voice suddenly came from inside the palace. Looking at the figure behind the table who stood up, the eunuch's face immediately turned pale. He knelt on the ground and said anxiously, "Your Majesty, please spare my life. Your Majesty, please spare my life. Although they took the wrong path, they are still the princess and prince of the Wu Kingdom. How can a slave like you impose the word rebels on them?" A skinny young man walked over from the front. His long and narrow eyes glanced at the eunuch and he said in a low voice, "Go and receive your punishment. Don't do it again. Thank you, Your Majesty. Thank you, Your Majesty." The eunuch hurriedly kowtowed. "Get up." The skinny young man waved his hand and asked, "Is there any news about them?" After the eunuch stood up, he immediately replied, "Your Majesty, General Qing said that he has already found traces of Princess Duanrong and Prince Jing. At most, he will be able to bring them back in a month. Tell him that they must not be harmed. Bring Qing and Fu back safely." If even a strand of their hair is harmed, I will hold him responsible. Yes, Your Majesty, I will definitely bring Your Majesty's message to General Chen. The skinny young man waved his hand and said, "All right, you can leave now." After the eunuch left, the skinny young man turned around with one hand behind his back. Only then did he realize that there was another person in the palace. It was an old man with white hair and beard. At this moment he was sitting on the seat that the skinny young man had just sat on. This was the imperial study, a seat that only the emperor could sit on. However, the young man was not angry or annoyed. Instead, he slowly walked forward and asked with a smile, "Imperial uncle, why do you have time to come here today?" The old man raised his head to look at him, and a sliver of disappointment appeared in his murky eyes. He said, "The blood that flows in the three of you is the blood of the royal family. You've already killed too many people. Just let these two children go. They can't threaten your throne. What you should do is to flatten the rebellious forces and return peace to the world as soon as possible." The young man was startled. Then he sighed and said, "Granduncle, you still don't believe me. Back then father and brother were suspicious. I kept retreating and retreating again and again. In the end, I really couldn't retreat anymore. If I didn't protect myself, I wouldn't be standing here talking to Granduncle. How do you expect me to believe you?" The old man stood up and looked at him. He asked, "I only traveled outside for half a year. After I returned to the imperial capital, you killed my brother, murdered my father, and forced my mother to death. Half of the officials in the imperial court died and another half ran away. The border army rebelled and another 3 provinces rebelled. How do you expect me to believe you? Whether what happened back then was right or wrong, whether imperial uncle is willing to believe me or not, I don't want to mention it again." The young man turned around and walked into the hall. He said, "Now our Wu kingdom is in a deep quagmire. The 2 kings of the Qi kingdom are fighting for power. However, the Jing kingdom is developing rapidly and suppressing all the other countries. I will suppress the chaos in the Wu kingdom as soon as possible. I also hope that imperial uncle can consider the overall situation and think for the sake of the Wu kingdom. If I didn't think for the sake of the Wu kingdom, I would have killed you with my palm." The old man walked past him and said calmly, "I don't care about the suppression of the rebellion. I don't want to look into what happened in the past. But I only warn you. Don't do anything to those 2 children again. Don't force me to do it." His last words were still echoing in the young man's ears. Then he disappeared. Suppress the rebels and restore peace to the world. But what if they are the rebels? The young man looked out of the door and murmured in a low voice, "Warn me? I am the emperor. Why should I be warned? Who else can warn me?" A hint of gloominess appeared on his face. He clenched his fists tightly in his sleeves. His nails dug deep into his flesh. Chapter 1047. In a mansion somewhere in the imperial capital of the Wu kingdom. Several figures were sitting in the courtyard, talking in low voices. Behind them were dozens of other figures. They were the elite subordinates who had entered the imperial capital with them. "What do you think they will bestow upon us this time? It shouldn't be a small one. If it weren't for us, they wouldn't have been able to defeat Princess Duanrong so easily." General Cheng has already gone to the palace to ask. There should be news soon. This world is really mysterious. At first I wanted to be a thief, but as I did so I actually became an official. I never dreamed that I, Big Head Ma, would be able to wear the hat of an official for the rest of my life. The few of them were all rebels. After the Wu kingdom fell into chaos a few years ago, they rose up in revolt and proclaimed themselves kings. A few days ago they were recruited by the imperial court and worked together with the imperial court to defeat another powerful rebel army. This time, they had come to the capital to receive their rewards and be promoted to officials. As they were talking, someone suddenly knocked on the door. Immediately, someone stood up and said with a smile, "Could it be that General Cheng has returned?" He personally went to open the door and saw the familiar face of General Cheng. "Haha, General Cheng, from now on we are colleagues." Puff. Before he could finish speaking, his body suddenly trembled. He lowered his head to look at a spear that had pierced through his chest. Blood flowed from the corner of his mouth as he looked at the man in front of him and said in pain, You. The man calmly pulled out the spear and then waved his hand. "Release the arrows." Rows of archers immediately swarmed in. In the courtyard there were endless curses and screams. "Cheng, you didn't keep your promise. I won't let you off even if I become a ghost. What are you doing? We're on the same side, we're on the same side." In the land of chaos. Near the top of a mountain in the Wu kingdom, a man with a dignified appearance was pacing back and forth in the hall. There was a hint of anxiety on his face. Report. A figure quickly rushed in from the entrance of the fort. After rushing in, he knelt on one knee and said loudly, reporting to General Wei, Her Highness was ambushed by the imperial court in Lin province. Fortunately, she has successfully escaped and will be here soon. The man's face darkened, and he immediately said, Qin Qing, you will personally lead 500 men to receive His Highness. Behind him, a man knelt on one knee and bowed, Understood. The other man hesitated for a moment before asking, General, sending 500 people at the same time is too big of a commotion. If the Wan brothers find out, I'm afraid. The middle-aged man's face darkened. The Wan brothers were a group of bandits dozens of miles away from this place. They had a large number of people and were extremely powerful. In the past few years, there had been occasional friction between the two sides. If the other side took advantage of the situation and attacked, it would be a big problem. He thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, Your Highness's safety is more important. Qin Qing set off immediately. At this moment, a weak voice suddenly sounded in everyone's ears. The messenger pursed his lips, looked at them and said, General, the Wan brothers, they... Immediately someone's expression changed and he asked, Could it be that they're making a move again? The messenger shook his head and said after a while, The Wan brothers, they... Someone couldn't hold it in any longer and said angrily, What happened to them? Tell us. They're repairing the road. The guard general was startled and frowned, asking, Repairing the road? The messenger looked up at him and nodded, saying, Our spies saw it with their own eyes. Not only the Wan brothers but also the Black Blind of the Twin Forks Ridge, the Mountain Patrol Tiger of the White Tiger Ravine. He pointed out the names of several famous bandit leaders in the vicinity, swallowed his saliva and said, They are all repairing roads. The Wan brothers, the Black Blind, the Mountain Patrol Tiger. These people he had just mentioned were originally the bandits of the Wu Kingdom. In the early years they were just a small group of bandits roaming the border provinces. Later on, the country was in turmoil, and some people gathered a huge force to form a separatist regime. In a small area, they were able to stand up to the imperial court. There were also people like the Wan brothers. Their strength was neither strong nor weak. They couldn't stand up to the imperial court and were unwilling to submit to other major forces, so they simply fled into the land of chaos, occupied a mountain and proclaimed themselves as kings. Over the years, they grew stronger like a rolling snowball and had long become the overlords of the mountain. They often left the mountain to plunder the common people and caravans. The guard general wanted to eliminate them, but they were powerless. Anyone would find it strange that such bandits would suddenly stop plundering and run off to do something as mindless as repairing roads. Someone seemed to recall something and said, General, I heard that 2 years ago, a new force rose in the Jing Kingdom. They had extraordinary strength and forcefully opened up the trade road connecting the Jing Kingdom and the Qi Kingdom. They swept away all the bandits along the road and escorted the traveling caravans and pedestrians. The bandits they subdued were all forced to pave the road and repair the bridge. The guard general looked at him and asked, You're saying that those people have already come here and subdued the Wan brothers, the Black Blind, and the Mountain Patrol Tiger at the same time, making these overlords personally pave the road for them and open up the trade road? Apart from this, I can't think of any other reason. Let's not talk about whether they came to the Wu Kingdom or not. Subduing the Wan brothers, the Black Blind, and the Mountain Patrol Tiger at the same time. Do you think there's such a powerful force in the land of chaos? The guard general shook his head and said, No matter what the Wan brothers are up to, let's first bring the princess and His Highness King Jing here safely, then we'll think about it. The man looked at the guard general in silence for a moment before he said, General, what I mean is, if they really subdued the Wan brothers, the next one will be us. What does this have to do with us? The guard general frowned again and asked, We have no problem with them subduing bandits, but we are not bandits. Why would they attack us? Do they really think the land of chaos is their territory? Dozens of miles away on the mountain road. A dark mass of people were busy on the mountain road. Behind them there was a long gray mountain road. A bald man stepped hard on the mountain road. After confirming that there was no problem with the quality, he continued to walk forward. He thought to himself, this thing called cement is really useful. It's much more convenient than quarrying stones from the mountains to pave the road. On a nearby mountain top, a young man looked at the woman in front of him with a respectful gaze and said, Leader, this is news from the Wu Kingdom. After the rebel army was defeated, Princess Duanrong disappeared. The Wu Kingdom's imperial court is also trying hard to find her. After reading the news, Mississippi Lu was silent for a moment before she said, "Send a letter to the stronghold. Tell them that I will return after a while. Leave the matters here to Lu Luo for the time being." "Where are you going?" A voice came from outside the door. When the young man saw the three people walking in, he cupped his hands and immediately retreated. Mississippi Lu looked at them and asked, "Why are you here?" Li found a chair and sat down. He said, "If we didn't come, we would have gone to the Wu Kingdom to look for you in a few days." Li was somewhat glad that he had rushed over as soon as possible. If he had been a day and a half later, he might have had to follow Rui's example and chase after his sister-in-law. Mississippi Lu looked at him and said seriously, "I can't leave her alone." Li nodded and said, "I didn't ask you to leave her alone. I just want to tell you not to be impulsive. It's impossible to save her from the hands of the Wu Kingdom's imperial court by yourself or with the help of Lu Meng. We have to think about it at length. Don't forget she's also my martial niece." Mississippi Lu finally nodded. Seeing his travel-worn appearance, she asked, "Are you hungry? I'll cook a bowl of noodles for you first." Fang rubbed his stomach and looked at her. He asked, "Second miss, can you cook another bowl?" Ahem. The sloppy old man coughed softly. Fang looked at him and said, "3 bowls?" Chapter 1048. The conditions in the mountains were harsh. Unlike in the stockade village, they couldn't eat delicacies here. They could only eat noodle soup with a few green vegetables floating on top. Even so, Li still ate with relish. Only now did he realize that he had misunderstood Rui. She was not unruly and unreasonable. She could be brutal and violent, gentle and virtuous, proud and charming, and domineering. Marrying a girl like her was equivalent to marrying several at the same time. God was really kind to him. Old Fang was also eating happily. He had truly lived a hard life, so he never haggled over what he ate. The sloppy old man didn't care either. In his eyes, there was only Wu Dao and second granduncle, and perhaps Changda and the Taoist nun he had been longing for a long time. After eating and drinking to their heart's content, it was time to get down to business. Whether it was Mississippi Lu alone or with the elites of the Lu League, it was not a good idea to rashly enter the Wu Kingdom to look for Yangliuking. The Wu Kingdom was a little smaller than the Jing Kingdom, but not by much. Without any clues, it would take them forever to search for Yangliuking like headless flies. It was better to stay put. Instead of looking for a needle in a haystack, it was better to continue to subdue the forces in the fringe while waiting for news. There were many people in the Wu Kingdom who were more eager to find Yangliuking than they were. There was no doubt about that. Moreover, there was news from the Wu Kingdom that the imperial court of the Wu Kingdom didn't care about her life and death. They ordered the local authorities to capture her alive. In this case, there was no need to be anxious. He just needed to be the fisherman who reaped the benefits in the end. This was what he liked to do the most. Mississippi Lu was not stubborn. After Li Yi analyzed all the pros and cons for her, she was not so impulsive anymore. Li Yi looked at her and said, "Don't worry, once there is news from the Wu Kingdom, we will immediately take the elites of the Lu League to rescue her. As long as she is not imprisoned in the Imperial Palace, we will be able to rescue her. As for the Wu Kingdom, we will send more spies to gather information." In fact, even if she was locked up in the palace, it was not impossible to rescue her, but it would be more troublesome and dangerous. She could not torment second granduncle all day. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "Are we just going to wait like this now?" Li Yi pondered for a moment and said, "If you're bored, you can first unite the fringe. There aren't many strongholds left, right?" Mississippi Lu nodded. "Not much." General Wei slowly paced around the room with his hands behind his back, murmuring, "What the hell are the Wan brothers doing?" A trace of doubt appeared on his face, but he quickly shook his head and stopped thinking about it. The most important thing now was to ensure the safety of Her Royal Highness. Once they entered the chaotic lands, the soldiers wouldn't be able to do anything to them. A momentary failure didn't mean everything. As long as the princess and Imperial Prince Jing were safe, they would have a chance to restore order and pull the traitor who killed his brother and father off the throne. At this moment, a young man rushed in from outside. He was panting heavily and looked extremely terrified. He shouted, General Wei, bad news, bad news?" General Wei's expression changed. He immediately asked, "Did something happen to Her Royal Highness and King Jing?" "No." The young man shook his head and said with difficulty, "General, it's them, they're here." "Them?" General Wei strode forward and asked, "Who are they?" In front of the stronghold, a bald man held a conical paper tube and shouted, Listen up, people inside you, he scratched his bald head. This was the first time he shouted. He was so nervous that he forgot what he was supposed to say. A trace of embarrassment appeared on his face. The next moment he raised the paper tube and continued to shout, "Put down your weapons and surrender. Those who obey me will prosper, those who oppose me will perish." Behind him there was a dense mass of people. In front of the crowd, Mississippi Lou tilted her head and looked at Li Yi. She said, "This is the last one." Li Yi looked at the stronghold in front of him. In the past few months, Mississippi Lou had led the Lou League's elite forces and swept through the entire fringe. The bandits they encountered would either escape as soon as they heard the news and escape from the fringe. Those who put up a stubborn resistance would be beaten into submission and dispersed to various places to build new structures. The progress bar was almost full. After sweeping the last wave of bandits, she would be the true king of bandits in the fringe. Mission objective: become the king of bandits. Mission progress: 99%. The bald man was still holding the paper tube and shouting, "I'll give you 30 minutes to think about it. If you don't surrender, we'll attack." There was no movement in the stronghold for a long time. When the incense stick was about to burn out, the stronghold gate slowly opened. A man with an upright face walked out from inside. He was dressed in plain clothes, but his gait was majestic and imposing. There was a faint aura that Li Yi was very familiar with. Behind him, dozens of archers had drawn their bows and pointed their arrows at the group of bandits. Li Yi was a little puzzled. Looking at their formation, they didn't look like bandits. Instead, they looked like soldiers. No one made a sound. The atmosphere was extremely solemn. The middle-aged man didn't look at the bald man. He looked around and looked at Li Yi and Mississippi Lou. He asked, "We have no grudge against you. Why are you forcing us to this extent?" The bald man raised his eyebrows and said loudly, "Eradicating evil for the people. Enforcing justice on behalf of the heavens." The middle-aged man turned to him and asked, "We are not bandits. We are just living in seclusion here. We have not done any evil deeds. How can you say we're eradicating evil for the people?" The bald man's expression was a little unpleasant. What kind of person would occupy a mountain and live in seclusion in a chaotic place where bandits were everywhere? Did they have nothing better to do? In the past, many people had explained this to them. Now they had all gone to repair roads. The middle-aged man looked at Li Yi and said, "You go back. We will mind our own business. Otherwise, don't blame us for being rude." Li Yi shook his head. They didn't come here to reason with these people. No matter who they were, this was a strategic place that they had to fight for. There was no need to reason with the bandits. Rude? The bald man smiled and weighed a black object in his hand. He asked, "Do you know what this is?" He lit the fuse and threw it behind a half-collapsed wall outside the stockade village. Boom. A deafening sound was heard, and the ground under everyone's feet shook. Even though these heavenly punishments were specially made and had limited destructive power, it was enough to collapse the wall. The middle-aged man looked at the flying smoke and dust. He was stunned for a moment and his expression finally changed. This is the Jing Kingdom's heavenly punishment. In front of him, a strong man had already put a knife to his neck. He grinned and said, "Surrender or I will raise this place to the ground." General Wei, hearing the voice behind him, the middle-aged man's face turned pale. After a long time, he waved his hand behind him and said in a hoarse voice, "Put down your weapons, don't resist." He looked at the charred ground and his face turned even paler. The Jing Kingdom's heavenly punishment was a nightmare on the battlefield. With heavenly punishment, it was enough to defeat enemies who were several times stronger than oneself. He had long heard of the heavenly punishment divine weapon, but he had always regretted that he had never seen it. However, he never expected that the first time he saw it would be under such circumstances. This wave of bandits did not have many people, only about 200 to 300. They were afraid of the power of the heavenly punishment and did not put up much resistance. Out of professional habit, after subduing a wave of bandits, the first thing they did was to search for the treasures they had plundered over the years. According to the Baldi, these were the poorest bandits they had ever robbed. Other than some food, there was nothing valuable. Li Yi began to believe what they had just said. They were not bandits, but as a colleague of the same profession he felt embarrassed for the bandits. Just now, he seemed to have heard the bandit leader's subordinates call him general. They did not even pay attention to the organization and actually copied the military. How could he be a good bandit? The middle-aged man's hands were tied behind his back, but his back was still straight. A Baldi stood beside him and as he swayed he asked, Tell me honestly, what's your name, where do you live, how many people are in your family, are you married? The middle-aged man looked at him but did not speak. The baldy poked his chest and frowned. I'm asking you a question, be honest. Son-in-law, second miss, there's still one more. Fong walked in from the outside with a man in his hand. The man was floating in the air, waving his hands and feet randomly while shouting, "What are you doing, are you crazy? I have something important to report to General Wei." When he looked up and saw that familiar figure, he immediately said, "General Wei, it's not good. Her Highness the Princess is surrounded by the Imperial Army in the Thorns Ridge. Deputy General Chen and 500 soldiers are fighting with their lives on the line. I'm afraid they won't be able to hold on for long." Before he finished speaking, he widened his eyes, looking at the General Wei, who was tied up like a fried dough twist. "General, what is he playing at?" Li looked at him, and after being startled for a while, he asked, "What princess?" The man glared at him and said angrily, "Are you stupid? Of course it's Princess Duanrong." Chapter 1049. Princess Duanrong. Li Yi and Mississippi Lu looked at each other, then shifted their gaze to the man and asked, "What did you just say?" "Say it again." "Shut up." The tied-up middle-aged man glared at the man, breathing rapidly and his eyes almost popping out of their sockets. He began to struggle strenuously. The rope on his body rubbed red marks on his exposed skin. No matter how slow the man who was brought over by Fong was, he knew that General Wei was tied up like this and was definitely not playing some indescribable game. Looking at Li Yi and Mississippi Lu, he said with a trembling voice, You, who are you?" Li looked at the middle-aged man and shook his head. "Don't waste your energy. The more you struggle, the tighter the rope is." He didn't know who had just tied the rope in such a shameful way. He looked at Lao Fong and said, "Untie him." As soon as the rope was untied, the middle-aged man suddenly rushed out of the village. Of course he was stopped by Fong. He lowered his voice and roared, "Let me go, I have something important to do. When I come back you can do whatever you want of me." "What's the use of going alone? Are you going to die?" Li looked at him and said indifferently before asking, "The princess he mentioned just now, is it Princess Duanrong of the Wu Kingdom, Yangliuking?" The middle-aged man no longer struggled and looked at Li Yi with a burning gaze. "How do you know the princess' name?" Li Yi signaled Fong to let him go with his eyes. Mississippi Lu had already walked to the side and was whispering something to Bai Su, who had a small chest. Li Yi looked at the baldy beside him and said, "Let them all go." The middle-aged man stood in a daze. He had experienced several ups and downs in a short period of time. Even if his mind was extremely firm, he still couldn't calm down for a while. Fong patted his shoulder and comforted him, "Don't be nervous, we're on the same side." Thorns Ridge. The Thorns Ridge was located at the border of the Wu Kingdom, and several dozen kilometers deeper into the Thorns Ridge was a chaotic land without jurisdiction. The nearby civilians and merchants wouldn't easily set foot there. Thorns Ridge, somewhere in the forest. The deputy general named Qin Qing wiped away the blood on his forehead and said in a hoarse voice, "Princess, I will lead 200 men tonight and we will fight our way out. When the time comes, we will stop them while the rest of us will escort you and His Highness King Jing to the north. Once we reach the fringe, we will meet up with General Wei and they won't be able to do anything to you too." Opposite him was a young woman with disheveled hair and bloodstains on her body. However, there was no fear on her face. Her gaze was sharp as she shook her head and said, "Tonight's surprise attack, everyone retreat with me, Princess." Qin Qing looked at him and said in a deep voice, "We have been forced to this point and there is no way out. This general hopes that your highness will not be stubborn and will look at the bigger picture. Imperial sister, I don't want to die, I don't want to die." A 13 or 14-year-old youngster staggered over, wiped his tears and cried, "Let's surrender, they won't kill me if we surrender, I don't want to die." Yang Liuqing looked at him with a complicated expression, but didn't say anything. Chen Qing looked at the youngster before him, clenched his teeth and said, "Your Highness King Jing, surrendering is useless, they won't let us go." A trace of resentment suddenly appeared on the youngster's face. He pointed at him and loudly said, it's all your fault, if you hadn't killed so many of their people, they definitely wouldn't have killed us." "Shut up." Yang Liuqing finally couldn't help but berate. He looked left and right and said, "Take him away." When the two guards carried him away, he was still flailing his arms and legs, shouting, "Imperial sister, I don't want to die, I don't want to die, save me, save me." When the youngster's voice could no longer be heard, Yang Liuqing looked at Qin Qing and asked, "What's the situation at the foot of the mountain?" Qin Qing pondered for a moment and said, "They are now temporarily stationed at the foot of the mountain. They sent a letter up, saying that as long as we surrender, they won't hurt your highnesses. The deadline is tomorrow morning, and if we don't surrender by tomorrow morning they will attack. They won't hurt." Yang Liuqing looked at the setting sun in the sky and said, "Based on second brother's character, I don't think he will let us go. He can't wait to kill all the princes. How could he let your highnesses go?" An old figure walked over, lightly coughed twice and said, "Let's do as General Qin said, we will force our way out tonight, and your highness will bring King Jing to the fringe to meet General Wei, Prime Minister." The old man waved his hand and interrupted her, "As long as your highness and King Jing are safe, we still have a chance." "Qin Qing," he suddenly shouted in a low voice. "Yes, General." "Arrange for our men to attack the foot of the mountain tonight, and escort your highnesses out of here." "Yes, Prime Minister." Qin Qing turned and left without looking back. They still had 300 men who could fight. If they forced their way out, there was still a glimmer of hope. After Qin Qing left, the old man looked at the forest in the distance, which was gradually disappearing into the darkness, and suddenly said, "Your Highness, if you can escape this time, don't come back." Yang Liuqing looked at him, her lips slightly parted, and said, "Prime Minister." The old man stretched out his hand and lightly pressed down, signaling her to stop talking. Then he said again, "King Jing is useless. This heavy responsibility should not fall on your Highness' shoulders. Your Highness, go to the Qi Kingdom, go to the Jing Kingdom, forget about the Wu Kingdom, forget about the hatred, forget about Princess Duanrong, and live a normal life." Yang Liuqing shook her head and said, "I once swore that if I can't avenge my father, my mother, and my brother, I am not a human. After all, we have nothing left." The old man sighed and said, "The Jing Kingdom is like the sun at noon, growing stronger day by day. The third prince of the Qi Kingdom has the heart to be the ruler of the world, and he also has the ability to govern the country. Yang Zhe killed his brother and father, and it is intolerable. Perhaps the Wu Kingdom is doomed, but the people are pitiful." Yang Liuqing lowered her head, clenched her fists and gritted her teeth and said, "I will not give up." The old man looked at her, and a trace of tenderness appeared in his eyes. Finally he shook his head, sighed and turned to leave. Yang Liuqing stood where she was for a long time. She clenched her fists so tightly that her nails had sunk deep into her palms. She looked up at the round moon in the sky, and her face was full of determination. But behind this unswerving determination, there was a deeply hidden weakness and helplessness. If it was possible, why would she be willing to shoulder such a deep blood feud? Why would she be willing to shoulder such a heavy responsibility that was suffocating her? Why wouldn't she want to be an ordinary woman? How she wanted to be an ordinary woman? Tomorrow would be the 15th. 3 years ago, she didn't have to face all the things she had to face today. She could still live in that small courtyard, the courtyard that carried almost all the happiness of her life. In that small courtyard, there was her Shifu who was strict but spared no effort in teaching her to be cold on the outside but warm on the inside. There was her Uncle Master Li Yi who was very lazy but never stumped by anything. There was also her gentle and virtuous Uncle Master Rui who had already reached the peak of martial arts. And there was also the innocent, silly but kind Miss Xiao Huan. That small courtyard and everything about Lu Meng were things that she could never let go of and forget in this lifetime. How were they now? When she left, Uncle Master Rui was pregnant. The child should be almost 3 years old now. She didn't know if it was a boy or a girl. Was Uncle Master Li Yi still so afraid of Shifu? She didn't know how his relationship with Miss Ruoqing and Miss Zueimo was. She didn't know if Shifu still often bullied Uncle Master. She also didn't know if Shifu had won against Princess Emingzu. She also didn't know if Shifu still blamed her until now. She turned her head and looked in a certain direction. She knew that they were now in Shuzhou, a chaotic place away from here. But this was a distance that she would never be able to cross in this lifetime. At the foot of the Thorns Ridge, figures were swaying and countless flames were blazing. At the forefront of the crowd, 2 generals on horseback were looking at the pitch-black mountain road. One of them turned his head and said, "General, we still have to wait for a night. Why don't we let them camp here first?" "No need." The man beside him waved his hand and said, "Attack at midnight." "Attack at midnight?" The man was startled and asked in disbelief, "But didn't His Majesty give an imperial edict that the princess and King Jing cannot be hurt?" "I don't know what imperial edict." The man in armor grinned and said in a low voice, "I only know that His Majesty wrote in the secret letter, 'Leave no one alive.'" Chapter 1050. The moonlight shone brightly above the thorn's ridge. Several hundred figures were gathered in an open space. A man named Qin Qing was arranging something in a low voice. Bai Chuan, lead 200 men and follow me to break out from the east. Yes, sir. A thin man knelt on one knee, cupped his fists and said loudly. Gu Yuan, lead the remaining 100 men and escort the 2 royal highnesses and the prime minister away. Head north. Once you enter the land of Bedlam, General Wei will send someone to receive you. Another man respectfully replied with a solemn expression. Yes, sir. Qin Qing's gaze swept across and said, remember this well. At all times and under all circumstances, you must ensure the safety of the 2 royal highnesses. In the distance, Yang Liuqing looked at the 300 soldiers that were quickly mobilized. She clenched her fists and revealed a trace of grief. Your Highness must remember to prioritize the overall situation. An old voice came from behind her. She loosened her clenched fists, looked at the old man and softly said, the mountain road is difficult and inconvenient. General Chen will arrange for a few people to take turns to carry the Prime Minister, but it will inevitably be bumpy. The Prime Minister will have to endure a little. The old man smiled and waved his hand, saying, this old man was born in Sangzhou and will be buried in Sangzhou. It can be considered a perfect ending. There is no need for such torment. Yang Liuqing looked at him and firmly said, we will escape. Below the thorn's ridge. A figure came from the side, walked to the front of the formation, bowed and said, General, there is news from above. They plan to break out at midnight and escort the princess and King Jing all the way north into the land of Bedlam. The general, covered in full armor, patted the horse's head and said, midnight? He smiled and said, pass down my order. Bring forward the time of the attack by an hour. Yes, sir. In the land of Bedlam, the mountain ranges shrouded in darkness were like giant hibernating beasts. On the backs of these giant beasts, there were figures rapidly moving. Because Wei Liang's movements were too slow, he was carried on the back of a tall man. The man's skeletal frame made him feel pain, and the violent jolting made him dizzy and almost vomit. The man seemed to have noticed something. He turned around and said, if you dare to vomit on me, I will throw you down from here. Wei Liang endured the disgust and asked with difficulty, May I ask this warrior, do you have a relationship with Her Highness? Up until now, he still hadn't figured out what had happened. He didn't know what these people were doing. Why did they suddenly rush up to their mountain and capture all of them? He didn't know why they immediately let them go after hearing the news about the princess, and then rushed to the Thorn's Ridge without stopping, seemingly to rescue the princess. He only knew that these people were strong, very strong. Any one of them could take down a dozen or even dozens of his resisting subordinates. His subordinates were all well trained, and they were all fierce soldiers who had fought on the battlefield. The weapons of these people were also very sharp. When his side swords and sabers clashed with them, they would either be chipped or simply broken into two. They were highly skilled in martial arts, and each of them was equipped with a magical weapon. More importantly, they had that terrifying sky law. If they were really going to rescue the princess, Wei Liang's heart finally surged with infinite hope. You're talking about Miss Yang? The man smiled and said, of course we're familiar with each other. She scolded me a lot at that time and even robbed my position on the heaven list. This time I have to get back at her. Wei Liang didn't understand a single word of this man's words. However, it didn't matter. As long as they were going to rescue the princess, that was enough. He looked ahead and a hint of joy appeared on his face. He said, the Thorn's Ridge is up ahead. Silhouettes leaped out of the forest one after another. They could already vaguely see the flickering flames in front of them. At the foot of the mountain, a deputy general looked to his side. After pondering for a moment, he asked, General, if we really kill the princess and King Jing, won't swords have no eyes? It's normal to have some accidents on the battlefield. The general glanced at him and said, when the time comes, hand over the person who accidentally killed the two princes and ask to be demoted from his position. Demoted from my position? The general looked at him and said with a smile, just wait for 2 more years. In the future there will be glory, splendor, and wealth that you won't be able to enjoy. Just as his voice fell, a soldier suddenly came forward and reported, General, someone is coming from behind. Someone is coming? The general frowned and asked, who? There are a lot of them, about 200 people. We don't know their identities, but they are rapidly approaching. The general turned his horse around and said in a deep voice, inform everyone to prepare to meet the enemy. They had 1,000 people attacking the mountain, and another 1,000 people guarding the foot of the mountain. Wouldn't it be easy to deal with these mere 200 people? The figures on the opposite side stopped about 100 feet away from them. Although the moon was bright, they couldn't see clearly until the other side also raised their torches. Then he saw a bald man walking out. His head was glowing under the light of the torches, and he was holding something in his hand. People on the opposite side, listen up. You've been surrounded, 200 people against 1,000, and he dared to say that he was surrounded. Hearing the loud voice coming from the opposite side, the general's face darkened. Suddenly he saw a familiar figure behind the bald man. Wei Liang. He didn't expect to be able to catch all the rebels in one fell swoop this time. He waved his hand and said, "They're all traitors and rebels. Kill them all, don't leave a single one alive." Wait a minute. The bald man on the opposite side suddenly shouted. The general raised his hand and the soldiers behind him stopped in their tracks. He wanted to hear what this bald man had to say in the face of death. Then he saw a little flame appear in the bald man's hand, and he struggled to throw something in his hand. That thing rolled to his feet. He sat on his horse and looked out. Boom. After an even more dazzling firelight, he couldn't see or hear anything. After this explosion, the army of nearly 1,000 people was left with only a series of screams and wails. At some point, someone finally couldn't help but scream. This heavenly punishment, this is heavenly punishment. It's heavenly punishment, this is heavenly punishment. General Wei died in battle. On the opposite side, the bald man who was hiding behind the mound walked out again. As if nothing had happened, he continued to shout, "People on the opposite side, listen up. You've been surrounded." A deputy general got up from the ground and shook his head. He shook off the dirt on his body and stood up. He said loudly, "They're outnumbered. Charge forward. Their heavenly punishment can't be used in close combat. If we charge forward, they won't be able to do anything." As soon as he finished speaking, dozens of flames streaked across like meteors and landed in the army. One of them landed at his feet. Time waits for no man. The situation on Yang Liuking's side was unknown. Li didn't have the time to waste on them. On the opposite side, behind a low mound, Wei Liang heard the deafening sound and the flashing flames. He looked at the man beside him and pursed his lips. He asked, "Brother, can I throw one myself?" Heavenly punishment was extraordinary and had long been famous in the various countries. It was a sharp weapon on the battlefield and also a nightmare for countless people. However, heavenly punishment couldn't be used without restrictions. It was easily affected by the weather and distance. If the two armies were engaged in a chaotic battle, this kind of weapon that didn't distinguish between friend and foe naturally couldn't be used. Finally, a dozen people were lucky enough to avoid heavenly punishment and rushed to the front. Then they flew back at an even faster speed. An 8 feet tall burly man rushed out from behind the mound. Their swords, sabers, spears and halberds couldn't touch him at all. When they were hit by him, their bones were broken and blood foamed from their mouths. Some people clashed with their weapons. Their weapons broke, then their bodies. Some people only saw the flashing sword lights in the sky and then nothing else. Some people stood there in a daze. They put down their weapons and raised their hands. Then, tens and hundreds of people. Wei Liang looked at the dozens of people who walked out and then looked back. There were even more people watching from the back. He finally began to realize what kind of monsters had attacked their mountain today. Chapter 1051. The Lu Alliance had 200 elites and countless experts on the Heaven List and Earth List. In addition to Tian Fa and the divine weapons in the eyes of ordinary people, Li didn't know where the limit of this combination was. If they were to fight against truly well-trained and well-coordinated elite soldiers, unless they were experts on the Heaven List, it would be difficult for them to display their individual strength. However, against 1,000 soldiers from the Wu Kingdom who couldn't even be considered elites, coupled with the fact that the other party had underestimated them and Tian Fa, the battle ended very quickly. It could even be said that it was a crushing victory. Hundreds of people crouched on the ground and formed a circle with their hands on their heads. In reality, after the two high-ranking generals had died, the remaining soldiers had seen how terrifying Tian Fa and the few experts on the Heaven List were. They didn't have much will to fight anymore. After all, although the other party had fewer people, each of them was like an inhuman monster with divine weapons and divine weapons. They also had the divine weapon Tian Fa on the battlefield. No matter how they looked at it, there was no need to fight this battle. Wei Liang had fought for half his life and had seen and even personally participated in many battles where the weak won against the strong. However, this was the first time he had seen such a simple and unpretentious way of winning. He was worried about the princess, so he didn't think too much. He quickly walked forward and grabbed a person's collar. He asked, "Where's the princess? Where's Her Highness?" After a while, he ran to Li Yi's side with an anxious expression. He said, "They have another 1,000 people who have just attacked the mountain. Her Highness only has 300 soldiers who can fight. We have to go and help her quickly." Li Yi looked behind him and said, "Leave 50 people behind to watch them. The rest of you go up the mountain immediately." These captives had already lost their will to fight. Leaving 50 experts behind was enough. Not knowing the situation on the mountain, Li Yi didn't dare to delay and led everyone up the mountain immediately. Wei Liang walked a few steps and seemed to have thought of something. He cut off the heads of the 2 generals who had been killed by Tian Fa and carried them in his hands. He ran up the mountain behind everyone. "Your Highness, you should surrender. Swords have no eyes. If you hurt the 2 princes, it won't be good." At the top of the mountain, a deputy general looked at the figure that was surrounded by hundreds of soldiers and was desperately resisting. Yang Liuqing's pure white clothes were already dyed red with blood. Some of it belonged to her and some belonged to her enemies. Behind her, the young man named Yang Fu had already fainted from fright and was protected by 2 people. The remaining 100 or so people around him had long since become bloodshot. A bitter smile appeared on Qin Qing's face. "Your Highness, I'm sorry. I'm afraid I won't be able to protect Your Highness this time. You've already done your best." Yang Liuqing brandished the sword in his hand. Every time his sword stabbed out, a person would fall to the ground. One of her arms was injured and drooped weakly, but her expression was unprecedentedly calm. There was only sword light in her eyes. At the periphery of the crowd, the deputy general looked at the stalemate situation and waved to the 200 people behind him. "All of you attack together. If anyone resists, kill them without mercy. Leave no one alive." Boom. As soon as he finished speaking, before the people behind him could move, a loud sound suddenly rang in their ears. The sound was like a thunderclap, resounding through the mountains and into everyone's ears. The stalemate situation paused for a moment. Everyone couldn't help but look down the mountain. Boom, boom, boom. Streaks of dazzling flames appeared in their line of sight in an instant, followed by a deafening sound. "What's that? The mountain god is angry? There, that's the direction of the camp." Flames and loud sounds came from the direction of the camp. They looked down the mountain with a look of horror. Qin Qing took the opportunity to kill a few more people. He protected Yang Liuqing and quickly retreated into the forest. He looked back. The brilliant flames at the foot of the mountain had already been extinguished. It was as if nothing had happened. He looked at Yang Liuqing's injured arm. His expression was ugly. "Your Highness, you're injured?" Yang Liuqing didn't look at him. Instead, he stared blankly out of the forest and asked in disbelief, Did you guys hear anything just now? Your Highness, did you guys hear anything?" Qin Qing was startled. He nodded and said, "Yes, there was a loud sound and flames." A smile finally appeared on Yang Liuqing's face. He leaned against a tree and said, "Hold on a little longer. Just a little longer." Outside the forest, the deputy general looked down the mountain that had returned to silence. After a long time, he looked away and said, "2 people go and see what happened at the camp." With that, he looked back into the forest and gritted his teeth. "Half an hour. I'll give you another half an hour. If you can't break through, bring your heads to me." "Yes." As the hundreds of people approached the forest again, someone suddenly shouted, "General, there are people coming up from the foot of the mountain." Looking at the dozens of figures leaping up, the deputy general's expression froze. He asked, "Who are they?" In a few breaths' time, someone had already rushed up and threw 2 objects at his feet. General Wei and General Xiao are dead. You have 10 breaths' time to surrender. With the help of the moonlight and the flames, the deputy general could already see what was at his feet. It was the heads of General Wei and General Xiao. He suppressed the shock in his heart and shouted, kill them quickly." Swoosh. As soon as he finished speaking, he heard the sound of wind breaking. He was shot between his eyebrows and fell to the ground. Boom. The dozens of people who had rushed up fell in a dazzling flame. The scene fell silent in an instant. Then it became a mess. No matter how strong the experts in the martial arts world were, even if they were grandmasters, their usefulness on the battlefield was limited. A group of well-trained and well-coordinated elite soldiers might not be able to do anything to a grandmaster, but it was no different from a nightmare for ordinary experts to be entangled by them. It was a pity that the group of people in front of them could not be considered elite soldiers. With the death of a few high-ranking generals, They immediately fell into chaos. A few heavenly punishment was enough to scare them out of their wits and make them put down their weapons and surrender. Of course, there were those who resisted with all their might. In the end, they really died. This was not the land of chaos. This was a battlefield. If they showed mercy to the enemy, they would not show mercy to themselves. The few generals were already dead, and those who resisted were also killed. The fact that the enemy could come up from the mountain road meant that the camp below had already been broken through by them. There was no chance of victory. The soldiers of the Wu kingdom all put down their weapons and were quickly controlled. Wei Liang looked worried. He walked forward and asked loudly, "Where's the princess? Where's the princess?" A figure poked his head out from behind a big tree in the forest and asked, "Are you General Wei?" Ching. Wei Liang hurried forward and looked at him. He asked, "Where's the princess?" As soon as he finished speaking, a weak figure walked out from the forest. Wei Liang took 2 steps forward and knelt down on one knee. He said loudly, "I'm late to the rescue. Please forgive me, Your Royal Highness." Yang Liuqing glanced at him and did not say anything. He continued to walk forward. Li Yi and Mississippi Lu stood there and watched as she walked slowly from afar. She seemed to be injured. Her steps were not steady, and her body was swaying as if she would fall at any time. Wherever she passed, the crowd automatically opened up a path for her. She walked to the front and stood in front of Mississippi Lu and Li Yi. She slowly knelt down and raised her head. Her eyes were filled with tears. "Your disciple greets Master and Uncle Master." Wei Liang widened his eyes at this scene. He did not hesitate for long before he knelt down on one knee and lowered his head at the same time. The princess had already knelt down. As a subordinate, there was no reason for him to remain standing. Chen Qing, who also did not know what had happened, also knelt down beside him. He temporarily suppressed his doubts. More and more figures walked out from the forest. They could not care less about the feeling of surviving a disaster. When they saw the figure kneeling in front of them, they were dazed for a moment. Then they immediately knelt down. Mississippi Lu lowered her head and looked at her. It was unknown how long she looked before she slowly spoke. "Get up." She did not get up. When she heard this familiar voice, a deep sense of exhaustion came from the depths of her soul. Her body softened and she fell to the side. Chapter 1052. Li Yi's body swayed, and he gently supported her before she fell to the ground. He held her back with one hand and carried her horizontally with the other hand under her legs. He turned his head and saw Mississippi Lu looking at him. He looked at the unconscious Yang Liuqing, then raised his head to look at Mississippi Lu and asked, "How about, you do it?" Sangzhou was located at the border of the Wu kingdom with the Thorns Ridge as the boundary. Further north was the chaotic land beyond the jurisdiction of the government. Ever since the current emperor massacred the imperial capital and sat on the throne, heroes had risen within the borders of the Wu kingdom. The government's control over the prefectures far away from the imperial capital had been greatly weakened. For a long time, Sangzhou had been occupied by the former border army loyal to the late emperor. Several generals who were loyal to the late emperor and the only princess of the empress wanted to overthrow the court and make the son of the late emperor, Prince Jing, the new emperor. Of course, this was all old history. Not long ago, the border army forces that Princess Duanrong belonged to had been wiped out by the court and several enlistment forces. They had suffered a crushing defeat and their troops were scattered. Princess Duanrong and the young Prince Jing had also disappeared, and Sangzhou was once again under the control of the court. The common people of Sangzhou inwardly felt regret. When Her Highness the Princess was still alive, she purged the bandits, sympathized with the common people and helped the poor. Now that Sangzhou had once again fallen into the hands of the court, their future days would be difficult. The current emperor was cruel and merciless. He killed his brother and father, and he didn't even let off the princess and prince who shared the same mother. It was said that last night, the government had dispatched more than 2,000 soldiers to encircle and suppress Princess Duanrong in the Thorns Ridge. The common people didn't dare to make a sound, but they were secretly indignant. Weren't these heartless people not afraid of the wrath of the heavens? Speaking of the wrath of the heavens, last night, around midnight, the Thorns Ridge was filled with heavenly thunder and flames soared to the sky. The deafening noise could be heard even in Sangzhou city. That night, many people in the city were awakened, their hearts trembling. In the morning there was news that last night, the government had dispatched more than 2,000 soldiers to encircle and suppress Princess Duanrong, but they hadn't returned. Immediately, countless people guessed that their actions must have angered the heavens, causing the gods to be enraged and send down heavenly lightning and earthly fire, leaving all those people there. Of course, these were all rumors. At this moment, at the foot of the Thorns Ridge, there was a group of people looking at the tragic scene of corpses strewn all over the mountain, and they couldn't help but vomit. Dead, they're all dead, even General Wei and General Shao. Quick, quick, send a message to the royal capital. In the Bedlam lands there was a winding mountain road that spiraled up the mountainside. At the front were several carriages and behind them were nearly 100 people. Wei Liang finally knew why the Wan brothers and the others were forced to repair the road. The winding mountain paths of the fringe that were difficult to traverse were now smooth and comfortable. They could even travel in carriages. The injured princess was in the carriage at the front. In this half a day he had also learned an unbelievable piece of news from the people around him. The ownerless Bedlam now had a master. The entire Bedlam lands was now in their pocket. If it wasn't for the princess, even if he, Wei Liang, once led an army of 100,000 soldiers, he wouldn't be able to escape the fate of repairing roads and bridges like the Wan brothers. He looked ahead and was puzzled. What kind of existence was the master of Her Highness the Princess? Li Yi leaned on a carriage, glanced at the carriage in front of him, and continued to close his eyes to rest. Now that Mississippi Lu's precious disciple had been found, he didn't have to worry about her anymore, nor did he have to worry about her doing anything impulsive. Yang Liuqing was injured, but fortunately it wasn't serious. He would be able to recover after a period of rest. They were now heading to the stronghold where Rui and Ruoqing Zumo were, which was about a day's journey away from here. At some point, the curtain of the carriage was lifted by a withered palm, revealing the figure of an old man. Li Yi had seen him once on the first day, but they had never spoken. After the old man lifted the curtain, he moved a little to the edge of the carriage. The old man was slightly injured in the conflict a few days ago, and his head was still wrapped in a white cloth. After experiencing the bumpy ride of the past few days, he looked a little weak. The old man looked at him, pondered for a moment and asked, "May I ask if you are Li Yi of Jianghu of Silla?" This old man had been in a half-conscious state for a few days, and he only woke up today. Li Yi was a little surprised. Could it be that the name of Jianghu of Silla had already spread out of the Jing kingdom and started to spread to the world? Li Yi didn't deny it, and the old man didn't seem to need him to admit it either. He sized him up and said, "I've long heard of the name Jianghu of Silla, but I didn't expect the famous Jianghu of Silla to be so young." "What a young hero!" Li Yi cupped his hands in obeisance. "You flatter me." Just as he was waiting for the old man to continue, the old man put down the curtain and didn't say anything else. Li Yi was a little disappointed. This old man didn't finish his sentence. He was so old, but he still didn't know any etiquette. According to the usual routine, shouldn't he first praise him for being handsome and capable? Then he should express his endless admiration for him? Finally, he should say that it was his honor to know the famous King Jing and ask if they could be friends in the future so that they could exchange contact information or something like that. With this kind of emotional intelligence, how could he be a prime minister? The old man in front of him was the prime minister of a country. This was what Li Yi had learned from the general named Wei Liang. When the emperor of the Wu kingdom killed his brother and father to usurp the throne, there was a wave of righteous people who jumped out to oppose him. Although this old man didn't stand out to oppose him directly, he secretly sent Yang Liuqing and Prince Jing out of the imperial capital. Later on, he even quietly left the imperial court to help them build up their power step by step and fight against the imperial court. Of course, he worked hard day and night, worked hard for several years and suffered a defeat. Now he was back to square one. At his age, he still had to run around and worry so much for a certain belief in his heart. Li Yi still had some respect for him. "Prime Minister, I want to see my sister." A youth's voice came from the carriage. The old man said softly, "The princess is injured. Your Highness, please bear with it for one more day. Wait until tomorrow." Li Yi knew that the youth in the carriage was Prince Jing, who was also Yang Liuqing's younger brother. He was the person they wanted to support to become the emperor of the Wu kingdom. That night, when the imperial court soldiers attacked the mountain, he seemed to have fainted from fear. This was normal. After all, he was only 13 or 14 years old. He was about to lose his life, so it would be strange if he wasn't scared. After all, not everyone was as mature as Li Han. When he was 11 or 12 years old, he could manage an entire mathematics academy. This year he was only 14 years old, but he had already become one of the big shots in the imperial court. Even the current prime minister and the 6 ministers had to completely listen to him on certain matters. Of course, children of the same age and the same prince were in completely different situations. One was the most famous genius child in the Jing kingdom, the dean of the Mathematics Academy, and an influential figure in the imperial court. According to a letter from Li Xian a few days ago, the former mathematics department of the Imperial College wanted to leave the Mathematics Academy and establish their own school. Li Han gladly agreed, but the condition was that they could pass his test. In the end, everyone failed on the test paper that Li Han gave them, including the professors and even the Minister of Mathematics. No one from the Mathematics Department of the Imperial College passed the test. As for the test paper, after a few teachers from the academy looked at the solution given by Li Han, they said that the solution was only a little complicated and did not exceed the limits of the imperial court. Li remembered that when he received the letter from the Dragon Boat Festival, he had asked him to come up with a few complicated math problems to give Li Han a hard time. To prevent Li Han from always showing off in front of him, Li had randomly come up with a few. It was a little complicated, but Li Han was not a person who could be measured by common sense. He had actually found all of the more than 30 auxiliary lines of the geometry problem. I'm not saying that you are trash. What I mean is that everyone here is trash. This was what Li Han said to the Minister of Mathematics in front of all the teachers and students in the Mathematics Academy. It was said that at that time, the Minister of Mathematics trembled with anger. The faces of the Mathematics department turned green. The situation was out of control. Li Han was completely blessed by the heavens. If he wrote a few books based on his own experiences, 14 years old, why am I so outstanding? You're flattering me, I'm just a genius. From a rebellious boy to the dean of the Mathematics Academy, the growth of a genius youth. This book would definitely be sold out in the Jing Kingdom. In comparison, this young man named Jianghu was also treated specially by the heavens. When he was 10 years old, his second brother killed his father and eldest brother and forced his mother to die. His older sister brought him to hide from the imperial court. She also had to shoulder the great responsibility of restoring the country and taking revenge. It was really not easy. Since ancient times, there were many people who successfully rebelled. However, there were even more who were suppressed and killed. With only a few hundred people under their command, it was easier said than done to overthrow a country. Li sighed. To be honest, he hoped that she could let go of these things and live a happy and stable life as an ordinary person. However, when he thought of her dedication and craziness in practicing martial arts, it would be very difficult to achieve this. Moreover, he could not control the life that she chose. In the carriage at the front, Yang Liuqing leaned against the carriage and looked down at Mississippi Lu. She said in a low voice, "Master, I'm sorry." Mississippi Lu looked at her and said coldly, "You left without a word for 3 years without any news. A simple apology is enough. Do you still see me as your master?" Yang Liuqing's face turned pale. She panicked and said, "Master, you can hit me or scold me, but don't chase me out." Mississippi Lu looked at her and raised her hand. Yang Liuqing raised her head and closed her eyes. Smack. A crisp sound came from the carriage. Yang Liuqing opened her eyes. After a moment of shock, she covered her butt and blushed. "Don't do it again." Mississippi Lu glanced at her and jumped out of the carriage. Chapter 1053. One of Yang Liuqing's arms was injured. On the way, Mississippi Lu had already treated the wound for her. The carriage couldn't directly enter the village, so Li had to carry her on his back for the distance from the carriage to the village. Even if Wei and Chen had 10 guts, they wouldn't dare to be intimate with Her Royal Highness. It couldn't be helped. However, Mississippi Lu was his disciple. Why should he carry her on his back? Although she was his martial niece and could be considered as half a family, but in the end there were differences between men and women. Even Bai Su, who had no breasts, no buttocks and was narrow-minded, following behind Mississippi Lu was stronger than him. Although she looked petite and weak, her strength could be ranked in the top 10 of the heaven list. Li was sure that she could definitely beat 10 of him. Carrying him up the mountain was not a problem at all. Speaking of Bai Su, Li always felt that this woman had a faint hostility towards him. It wasn't just because he accidentally touched her non-existent breasts last time. That look in her eyes, it seemed, as if he had stolen her man. After she looked at him with that kind of look for the umpteenth time, Li finally couldn't stand it anymore. He glanced at her flat chest and said seriously, "I like women." This explained that touching her chest last time was purely an accident. After all, compared to Rui, she could only be considered as half a woman. It also explained that he wouldn't steal her man. There was only one man who usually hung around her. Did this girl like Fong? Bai Su looked at him with a resentful look. She gritted her teeth and said, "Me too, Li was stunned on the spot. Did she mean that although she had no breast she was still a woman, implying that he could like her? Or, did she like women as much as he did? Should be the former. He sighed. There were so many women in the world. He couldn't fall in love with everyone he met. It was enough to take care of the few women in his family. He could only let the thousands of women represented by Su be sad and disappointed. Yang Liuqing was arranged to stay in the prince's mansion. Rui and the others had already received the news. They were talking in her room. Li Yi stretched his muscles and walked out of the mansion. The most important thing for her now was to recuperate. It would take about a few months to recover to her peak state. When she was better, Zumo and the others should also be tired of living in the mountain. Then they would return to Shuzhou together. As for other things they would take their time to consider. Wei Liang and Chen Qing stood on the dustless street paved with blue stones. They looked at the bustling crowd and the rows of shops on both sides of the street in a daze. A hawker carrying a pole passed by them, and the sound of reading came from the school not far away. They even saw a rough man walking while shaking his head and reciting the words, "Raise your head to look at the bright moon, lower your head to think of your hometown." For a moment they even thought that they had come to the imperial capital. No, this place was cleaner and tidier than the imperial capital. It looked even more prosperous than the imperial capital. There were many things that they had never even heard of in the street shops. There was actually such a place in the chaotic land where bandits were rampant and everyone despised it? They suddenly felt a little inferior. Yang Fu did not feel inferior. He swallowed and stood in front of a small stall on the street. It was called a small stall, but it was actually a small moving cart with a glass box on it. He had seen glass before, but he had never seen such a big glass box, and he had never seen people using glass as a box to sell things. Inside the transparent glass box was food that he had never seen before. It was strung together on skewers and looked crystal clear. He knew that it was food because there was a little fatty of his age next to him who was holding a skewer and licking it happily. The little fatty looked at the young man who was standing in front of the candied hawthorn and asked, "Do you want to eat candied hawthorn? It's 2 copper coins per skewer. You can choose any skewer you want. Buy 5 skewers and get 1 free." Only then did Yang Fu know that this thing was called candied hawthorn. He was a prince. In the past he could eat whatever he wanted. Things that flew in the sky, swam in the water, and all kinds of delicacies. But that was in the past. Later on, when he traveled around the various states, he had more opportunities to eat vegetables. The crystal clear thing in front of him seemed to be more delicious than any delicacies he had eaten before. He had no money and he had never touched money. The little fatty looked at him and scratched his head. He took out a candied hawthorn from the box and handed it to him. He said, "My name is Lin Hu. They all call me Fat Tiger. I have never seen you in the stockade. This candied hawthorn is for you. Let's be friends." Yang Fu looked at him, and a trace of anger suddenly appeared on his face. He hit the candied hawthorn to the ground. He was King Jing, the future emperor of the Wu kingdom. How could he accept the charity of a lowly commoner? How could he be friends with a lowly commoner? The little fatty's hand that was holding the candied hawthorn was still extended forward. He did not expect such a big reaction from Qin Haodong. He looked at him in a daze. Yang Fu fiercely stepped on the candied hawthorn a few times and said angrily, "I don't want to eat your stupid candied hawthorn, and I don't want to be friends with you. I don't want to be friends with you either." The little fatty looked at the candied hawthorn that he had stepped on and sniffed. He looked at Qin Haodong and said, "You have to pay." Yang Fu glanced at him and said disdainfully, "I won't pay." The little fatty frowned and said, "You are making things difficult for me, Fat Tiger." Yang Fu raised his eyebrows. "So what if I make things difficult for you?" The little fatty looked down at the mess on the ground and said, "Then do you dare to spit on the ground again?" Bah! Yang Fu spat on the ground and looked at him. He said disdainfully, "I will spit." "So what?" The little fatty turned around and waved at a man wearing a red armband on the street. He said, "I want to report someone. Someone spits on the ground and litters everywhere." The man quickly walked over and asked, "His Highness is back, but he still dares to commit crimes. Little brother, tell me who is so unethical." The little fatty pointed at the youth opposite him and said, "It's him. Whose family's little brat is this? It's time to teach him a lesson." The burly man said as he tucked the handsome but immoral little brat under his arm. He then turned around and walked towards the direction of the school. "Let me go, let me go. How dare you? I will punish you." Yang Fu was almost vomited by the strong smell of a fox. His face turned green and his limbs flailed wildly. Stop. Let go of His Highness. Two shouts rang in his ears. He had just taken 2 steps when he found 2 figures in front of him, glaring at him. A rebellion. The big man did not let go of the youth under his arm and said loudly, "Brothers, someone is rebelling." Crash. The door of the opposite building was pushed open. 10 or so men with red armbands walked out and surrounded Wei Liang and Qin Qin. Their expressions immediately changed and their momentum immediately weakened. They looked at the big man and said, "Put His Highness down first. We can talk, talk my ass. This little brat litters everywhere and is unhygienic. We should discipline him on behalf of his parents." Cough. Cough. An old man walked over from behind and asked, "What happened?" Li Yi had been standing far away from the beginning. He slowly walked over and looked at the old man and said, "This is the rule here. Those who urinate, spit, and litter everywhere need to attend class and complete a test as punishment." The old man nodded and said, "There are no rules. Since we are here, we must abide by the rules here." He looked at the big man and nodded. "Thank you. I don't want to attend class and I don't want to take a test." Yang Fu was still struggling when he was taken away by the big man. Prime Minister Wang said. Wei Liang and Qin Qing looked at each other and did not stop him. The old man watched Yang Fu be taken away by the big man. Then he looked at Li Yi and asked doubtfully, "I have never heard of such a punishment. Is there a reason for it?" Li Yi nodded and said, "Most of the people in this stockade have never studied. Making them attend class and take a test is much more useful than giving them silver or corporal punishment. They would rather starve outside than go in and study. Once they experience this kind of punishment once, they will never do it again." The old man was stunned, then he smiled and said, "Wonderful, really wonderful. To think that you can come up with such a wonderful method. Jianghu of Silla is really a god. You flatter me." As the two of them were exchanging pleasantries, the big man walked out with Yang Fu. He scratched his head gloomily and looked at Li Yi. He said, "Just in time for the test. This kid has actually studied and can write all 5 words. He thought that it had taken him 2 months to come out, but this kid had only used less than 15 minutes. The big man was even more depressed. Yang Fu looked proud and said, "Isn't it just writing? What's so difficult about it?" The old man smiled and looked at Li Yi. He said, "Although this method is wonderful, it has its limits. For those who have studied, there are not many restrictions. Instead, it will help them. Jianghu of Silla should think of another punishment method." Li Yi shook his head and said, "Prime Minister, you are wrong. Rewards and punishments need to be measured. How can blindly punishing people without rewards be the solution?" The old man thought for a moment and nodded. What Jianghu of Silla said makes sense. For such a young child, it is better to guide him. Rewards and punishments are the right way to go. He touched Yang Fu's head and said, "You did very well in the test this time. You should be rewarded. I have a book called Elementary Mathematics. It is a secret textbook of the Jing Kingdom School of Mathematics. There are 100 classic examples in it. If you can solve all of them, you will be able to see the door of mathematics." Li Han, the king of Jin, started from this book and became the dean of the Jing Kingdom School of Mathematics. "I don't pass this book to ordinary people, but this time it is your reward." He pointed at Yang Fu and turned to look at the big man. He said, "Take him to the confinement room. I will ask someone to send the elementary mathematics over. Watch him personally and don't come out until he is done." Chapter 1054. Li Han and Yang Fu were about the same age and they were both princes. Therefore, Li Yi would always compare the two of them, whether intentionally or unintentionally. The result of the comparison proved a problem. There was still a gap between people and princes. At the same age, one of them was already in charge of a mathematics school, stirring up the court, reaching the peak of his career, but he was still flirting with girls and could even roast good fish. The other one was still showing off his power as a prince because of a candied hawthorn. It was obvious who was better. Of course, this was also related to their respective circumstances. Li Han was a genius, and in the eyes of almost all his peers, he was someone else's child. He couldn't be used as a standard, as this would be a blow to more than 99% of people. Although Yang Fu was a prince, he had suffered much more than a normal child. Unfortunately, these hardships and setbacks didn't hone his inhuman state of mind. Instead, they made him more extreme and violent. This was the impression Li Yi had of him after a few days of observation. He didn't care much about this. After all, he was still a child. As long as his nature wasn't bad, there was still a chance for him to change. Of course, this was the responsibility of Yang Liuqing and Prime Minister Wang. He didn't have this obligation. Let me out, let me out. This question is too difficult, too difficult. I don't know it, I don't know it. I was wrong, I shouldn't have littered, I shouldn't have spat, I was wrong, let me out. Sister, sister, Prime Minister, General Chen, General Wei, help me. Hearing the screams coming from the confinement room, Li Yi shook his head and turned to leave. Although it was only elementary mathematics, it took Li Han a lot of time to completely understand the book with his help. If Yang Fu studied it by himself, he probably wouldn't be able to solve half of the questions in his lifetime. His goal wasn't to let him solve the questions. This wasn't the Wu Kingdom, and it wasn't the border army that was loyal to them. It wasn't a bad thing to temporarily suppress his arrogance. Wei Liang and Qin Qing stood outside the confinement room and looked at Imperial Prince Jing, who was frantically banging on the door. Wei Liang then turned to look at the old man and helplessly said, "Prime Minister, look this." The old man waved his hand and said, "Let's follow Jianghu of Silla's arrangements first. It's good to dampen his spirit." Wei Liang looked at a figure in the distance and whispered, "Prime Minister, this is Jianghu of Silla? This Jianghu of Silla is an extraordinary person." The old man looked into the distance until Li Yi's figure disappeared. Then he said, "He has done a lot of great things. The talented Prince Jin of the Jing Kingdom was trained by him. Prince Jin is younger than Prince Jing, but he can already take charge of the court and command the wind and clouds." Sigh. He let out a long sigh as a desolate expression appeared on his face. Since he is a genius, how can he be trained? Wei Liang shook his head and said, "I don't think he is that powerful except for his good looks." The old man glanced at him and said, "If you still want the plum's art of war, that you have been dreaming of, you better not think that way." What? Wei Liang looked at him in surprise. Because that book was written by him. As soon as he finished speaking, Wei Liang, who was next to him, disappeared, leaving only a cloud of smoke that slowly dissipated. On the other side, the general named Qin Qing opened his mouth and looked at the old man. He asked in disbelief, "Prime Minister, did he really write the Plum's Art of War? How could it be? He is so young." Plum's Art of War was a magical book that existed in the hearts of the generals and soldiers of various countries in recent years. It was said that this book recorded countless ways to defeat the enemy on the battlefield. It was very mysterious. Unfortunately, this book was tightly controlled by the military of the Jing Kingdom and was not leaked to outsiders. They only heard of this book's name. They only knew that the armies of the Qi Kingdom and the Zhao Kingdom had suffered a lot because of this book. General Wei had admired this book for a long time. It was understandable that he couldn't control himself when he heard this news. Is it wrong to be young? The old man looked at him and asked, "Is the Emperor of the Jing Kingdom young? Is the Princess Royal who assists the government young? Is the third prince of the Qi Kingdom young? Is Prince Jin Li Hanyan young?" His question made Qin Qing speechless. The Emperor of the Jing Kingdom devoted himself to developing the country with science and technology. The research of the Academy of Sciences had a lot of applications in agriculture and military formations. The Princess Royal of the Jing Kingdom had the talent to rule the country. She was not inferior to any wise monarch that he could name. He had also heard about the deeds of the third prince of the Qi Kingdom, Zhao Yi. As for Prince Jin of the Jing Kingdom, Prime Minister Wang often mentioned this name, which often made him doubt that he had lived so many years in vain. These young people really didn't leave a way for the old people to live. However, he hadn't seen the book, so he didn't know whether it was true or not. He still felt that the heavenly punishment was easy to use. It was simple and straightforward. No military strategy could compare to a pile of heavenly punishment. Seeing his expression, the old man knew what he was thinking. He said, "I forgot to tell you that the heavenly punishment of the Jing Kingdom was also made by the Jianghu of Silla, Li Yi." He patted on Qin Qing's chest, where there was a scar that spread to his neck. "Also, if you really want to think about it, your life was also saved by the Jianghu of Silla." The old man shook his head and said, "If it wasn't for the suturing method he proposed, you would have died on the battlefield because of excessive blood loss a year ago." Qin Qing opened his mouth, looked down at his chest, and was stunned. The old man sighed and looked at Prince Jing, who was still howling in the room. A thoughtful expression appeared on his face. After a long time he sighed again, turned around and left slowly. Li Yi sat on the stone bench in the yard, rubbing his eyebrows and thinking about something. Yang Liuqing was injured, so it was impossible for him to raise the flag to rebel in a short time. In the border army that had been loyal to her, besides the two generals, Wei Liang and Qin Qing, and less than 500 disabled soldiers, There was only an old man and a retarded younger brother who drooled at the sight of candied fruits. Mission objective: overthrow the rule of the tyrant of the Wu Kingdom, establish a new imperial court, and help the retarded younger brother to ascend the throne. Mission progress: 0% mission conditions. A general, a deputy general, 500 disabled soldiers, an old man, a retarded younger brother and herself. Mission difficulty: maximum. Your Highness Jianghu of Silla. Wei Liang walked over slowly and rubbed his hands cautiously. He looked at Li Yi and thought for a long time. Finally, he plucked up his courage and asked, "Have you eaten?" Li Yi looked at him and shook his head helplessly. There was only one general and he was retarded. How could he play this game? There was no chance of winning. There were only a few people in the beginning and they didn't have any equipment, but they still wanted to overthrow a country. Even he, as her martial uncle, was worried about her. Plum's Art of War was actually a hodgepodge of things like 36 stratagems, 6 secret strategies, 3 strategies. After being organized and mixed together, it was named by the shameless Li Xian. This was actually not a secret. War could not be won by relying on a book on military strategy. The outside world's evaluation of this book was too high, and there was a lot of exaggeration. He took out a book from the study and lent it to Wei Liang. When he took the book, his hands were trembling. If not for Li Yi's support, he might have knelt down and kowtowed to him on the spot. After sending him off with great difficulty, Li Yi thought of something. He walked into the study and took out a brocade box from the cabinet. Then he walked out of the study and walked to the door of Yang Liuking's room. He knocked on the door and walked in. "Martial uncle." Yang Liuking sat up from the bed. Her voice was a little weak. "Don't. Just lie down." When Li Yi walked over, she was already sitting up. He handed the brocade box to her and said, "Last year, I met a businessman from the Wu Kingdom. He said this was your mother's legacy. I don't know if it's true. Open it and take a look." When Yang Liuking opened the brocade box and saw the phoenix hairpin, her body trembled. The next moment, her eyes were filled with tears and big drops of tears rolled down her cheeks. She bent her legs and wrapped her arms around her knees. At first, she sobbed softly, but soon she burst into tears. Li Yi gently patted her back. She was carrying so many things on her back. Crying out loud would help her release some of it, which was good for her body. "I've cooked porridge. Try it." Mississippi Lu walked in from outside with an exquisite tray in her hands. In the room beside the bed, the woman wrapped her arms around her knees and cried extremely sadly. It was as if she had made a vow with a man and was cruelly abandoned. Li Yi sat beside her. It was as if he had gotten a girl's body with sweet words and then abandoned her. Chapter 1055. Li Yi looked at Mississippi Lu, then got up and walked out. Although the situation in the room seemed to be easy to misunderstand, he believed that Rui wouldn't. Rui understood him. When he and Rui were in the Qi Kingdom, when Rui was injured and couldn't fight back, he and Rui shared a room together. He didn't do anything out of line for a few months. Let's not talk about the past, let's talk about the recent events. On the day of the wedding, he was locked out by Rui and the other two. Rui took him in. Both of them were drunk and slept on the same bed. Didn't he not take advantage of her? Third Miss Chin stood in the yard and watched Li Duan and Yong Ning play. When she saw Li Yi coming over, she asked, "How's the girl?" "She's fine." Li Yi shook his head and said, "She's been through a lot. It's hard for her to hold it in. She'll be fine after crying." She nodded and said, "It's good that she's fine. I've heard from Rui about this little girl's background. I don't know how much suffering she's gone through to reach this stage. It's not easy." Li was very happy. Even if Rui didn't understand him, his godmother did. At least she wouldn't misunderstand him. Third Miss Chen looked at him and said, "This girl's life is pitiful. Don't let her down again." Li was stunned. When he came to his senses, he immediately explained, "Mother, what are you talking about?" I just saw you carrying her back." Li paused. That's..." Third Miss Chen waved her hand and said, Okay, I'm not blaming you. You're so capable. I'm happy that so many girls like you." Li looked up and saw that she had turned around and walked out. He hurriedly said, "Hey mother, don't go. Mother, listen to me." His godmother might have misunderstood him. No matter how he tried to explain, she just smiled. Li decided not to explain anymore. Time would prove his innocence. Yang Liuking's younger brother, Yang Fu, seemed to have some misunderstanding towards him. These few days, he had been avoiding him whenever he saw him. Once, when he was sitting outside, he saw Yang Fu coming out of Yang Liuking's courtyard. Halfway there, he noticed Yang Fu and immediately hid behind a big tree. He sat there thinking about the future management of the French. He also wrote letters to Li Xian, Mingzhu, Shaning, and the others. He sat there for more than 2 hours. Yang Fu hid behind the tree for another 2 hours. Before he left, he looked back and saw that Yang Fu had also come out from behind the tree. His pants were wet. Holding one's urine wasn't good for the body. A 14-year-old child actually held it in until he peed his pants. He could do it anywhere he wanted. Rules were dead, but people were alive. He couldn't just hold it in just because there was a rule that prohibited people from urinating or defecating anywhere they wanted. At most, he would be caught and forced to do some math problems. He had only completed less than 10 problems in the basic mathematics set. It took him 3 days. Li wasn't a rigid person. He asked the man to let him out. If he couldn't finish it, he could do it slowly. After all, there would be plenty of opportunities. Yang Fu was still young and didn't understand the value of basic mathematics. On the other hand, the old man named Wang treated it like a treasure. These days he often brought the book to Li Yi for advice. Any old man who could sit in the position of prime minister at his age was not someone to be trifled with. The questions he asked were all beyond the concepts and standards of this world's mathematics. After all, the mathematics standards of the Wu Kingdom had been surpassed by the Jing Kingdom by a lot. Not only did the Wu Kingdom not have any new mathematics, but the Wu Kingdom also didn't have any perfume or liquor. The Wu Kingdom didn't even have candied fruits. Mathematics didn't belong to Li Yi, nor did it belong to the Jing Kingdom's Mathematics Institute. Li Yi didn't mind the old man implementing it in the Wu Kingdom after he learned it. Of course, he was only a prime minister now, so he couldn't implement it even if he wanted to. Thank you, Jianghu of Silla, for answering my questions. The old man put away the basic mathematics book that was almost torn to pieces. He stood up and said, "I'm going to see the princess." Li Yi waved his hand and said, "She hasn't fully recovered yet. Prime Minister, be careful with your words." "I know." The old man nodded his head and turned to leave. When the old man walked in, there were still a few people in Yang Liuking's room. Yang Fujing stood in front of the bed and said pitifully, "Sister, I don't want to go to the confinement room anymore. I don't want to do mathematics either. Let's go back, okay?" In the past few days he finally realized one thing. This wasn't the Wu Kingdom, nor was it the military. Other than Wei Liang and Qin Qin, no one treated him as King Jing. No one would listen to his orders. He just spat on the ground and was thrown into a dark room to calculate problems for 3 days. What kind of problems were those? Who would want to solve them? However, he had to do it. If he didn't do it, he wouldn't be given food. If he didn't eat, he would starve to death. Even his sister and the prime minister couldn't save him. Although there were a lot of delicious food and fun things he had never seen before, he didn't want to stay here for another day. He didn't want to see that person anymore. The old man walked over and looked at him. He smiled and said, "Your Highness, please go out and play for a while. I have something to discuss with the princess." Although Yang Fujing was unwilling, he pouted and left quickly. The prime minister and his sister definitely had something important to talk about. If he caused trouble at this time, his sister would punish him and the prime minister wouldn't be able to protect him. After Yang Fujing left, Wei Liang closed the door and stood at the door with Qin Qin. The old man walked to the bed and asked, "Your Highness, are you feeling better?" Yang Liuking nodded. "I'm fine now. I'll recover after some rest." She leaned against the side of the bed and looked out the window. She said slowly, "Sangzhou has fallen back into the hands of the imperial court. General Fan and the others were scattered. I don't know where they are now," the old man comforted her. "General Fan won't fall into the hands of the imperial court so easily. Your Highness, just focus on recuperating. When you recover, we'll start all over again. You'll definitely be able to see General Fan again?" Yang Liuking nodded slightly. The old man looked at him and suddenly said, "If Jianghu of Silla?" "No." Before he could finish, he was interrupted by Yang Liuking. Yang Luqing raised her head, looked at him and said seriously, "The Prime Minister said no." She knew what Prime Minister Wang wanted to say. Prime Minister Wang also knew what he wanted to say. A few years ago, Her Highness swore to practice martial arts for revenge. She hid it from them and secretly came to the Jing Kingdom. She stayed in the Jing Kingdom for a long time. During that period of time, in order to avoid being captured by the imperial court, they hid in the fringe. Even though they knew how naive the princess was at that time, no matter how skilled she was in martial arts, It was impossible for her to fight against an entire country alone. However, they failed to stop the princess. 2 years later, Her Highness returned. No one knew what His Highness had experienced in those 2 years. They only knew that His Highness's martial arts had improved by leaps and bounds. During battles, he would always take the lead and become a legend on the battlefield. He won the respect of all the soldiers and became their belief. It wasn't until a few days ago that he learned about the relationship between Her Highness and this Jianghu of Silla. He was Jianghu of Silla's martial nephew. Jianghu of Silla's wealth was comparable to that of a country. He also possessed the method to create divine punishment. He also had a powerful and mysterious force in his hands. He even unified the vast fringe. In the Wu kingdom, other than the imperial court, no other force could contend against him. More importantly, he was Jianghu of Silla. Jianghu of Silla Li, a man who repeatedly created miracles, a man who was good at creating miracles. If there was anyone who could help Her Highness accomplish this, that person was none other than Jianghu of Silla. This was practically their last and greatest hope. Your Highness. The old man looked at her and slowly knelt in front of her. His voice was deep. Your Highness. Wei Liang and Qin Qing knelt down in front of her at the same time. Yang Liuqing looked at them with a pained expression. She shook her head and said, 3 years ago I've let Master and Uncle Master down once. I can't let them down a second time. She turned to the 3 of them and said seriously, don't ever mention this again. Chapter 1056. Her Highness's attitude was very firm. The old man named Wang sighed and slowly stood up. He couldn't deny that he was deeply shocked by Jianghu of Silla's wealth and influence. What kind of wealth would it take to build such a paradise in the land of chaos? What kind of tyrannical power would it take to unite the land of chaos that had been in chaos for hundreds of years in one fell swoop? They had divine punishment, divine weapons, and a group of powerful subordinates. If they could get his help, they wouldn't have to worry about not succeeding. But this matter could only be proposed by Her Highness. If Her Highness was unwilling, there was nothing he could do. He said apologetically, this old subject was presumptuous. I hope Your Highness can forgive me. It's fine. Yang Luqing shook her head and looked out of the window. The trees in the distant mountains were lush and there was an unknown fragrance of flowers drifting in from outside. She took a deep breath and a long-lost smile appeared on her face. The plan to restore the dynasty can be discussed after Your Highness recovers. The old man named Wang paused for a moment before speaking again. This old subject is worried about His Highness King Jing. Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked, what's wrong with Yang Fu? The old man sighed and said, His Highness King Jing disappoints this old subject. He was originally just a little disappointed in King Jing. But ever since he came here and saw Jianghu of Silla every day, he didn't dare to compare King Jing to Jianghu of Silla. Instead, he couldn't help but think of Prince Jin. At first, he could use the excuse that King Jing was young and mischievous to deceive himself. But in terms of age, Prince Jin was even younger than King Jing, so how could he? Every time he thought of the gap between the two of them, the disappointment in his heart turned into despair. If King Jing continued like this, even if they were lucky enough to seize power from the perspective of the people of the Wu kingdom, it would be better to let the traitor who killed his brother and father become the emperor. Yang Liuqing sighed. A trace of disappointment inevitably appeared on her face, but it quickly disappeared. She smiled and said, Yang Fu is still young and with the Prime Minister's guidance he will definitely change his naughty nature. The old man surnamed Wang nodded. He could only use this excuse to deceive himself. Yang Liuqing thought for a moment, and her beautiful eyes suddenly lit up. She said, if Martial Uncle is willing to teach him, I think he will quickly change his mischievous nature. That Prince Jin Li Han was taught by Martial Uncle. I remember Martial Uncle said that Li Han used to be very mischievous. The old man surnamed Wang did not doubt Her Highness's words. The fearless imperial Prince Jing, after spending 3 days in the confinement room doing math problems, was now most afraid of Jianghu of Silla. He even took a detour when he saw Jianghu of Silla. He, Ning Yuan, would rather hide behind a tree and wet his pants than see Jianghu of Silla. If it's Jianghu of Silla, perhaps it will be of some use. The old man thought for a moment, then shook his head and said, but His Highness Imperial Prince Jing will definitely be very resistant to this. Moreover, no matter what, His Highness is the son of the former emperor, the legitimate heir of the royal family. His Highness teacher must also be a famous scholar. If he takes Jianghu of Silla as his teacher, I'm afraid there will be many troubles in the future, which will not be beneficial to the great cause. Her Highness Imperial Prince taking a teacher was already unimaginable. The Prince of Wu country, the future emperor, was taking the King of Jing country as his teacher. This was an unjustifiable matter. It was inevitable that people would gossip about it and it would be detrimental to their future plans. Once it was used by someone with ulterior motives, it would become a great obstacle on their path forward. To be able to receive Martial Uncle's guidance is a blessing that he has cultivated for several lifetimes. Yang Liuqing looked out the window and sighed, I'm afraid that Martial Uncle won't be willing. The old man surnamed Wang thought for a moment and said, if he can become the teacher of the future emperor, why wouldn't Jianghu of Silla be willing? The emperor of the Jing kingdom is already half his disciple. Most of the princesses and princes of the royal family of the Jing kingdom are also Martial Uncle's disciples. What's the difference if there's one more Yang Fu or one less Yang Fu? Moreover, she withdrew her gaze from the window and murmured, moreover, Martial Uncle is lazy. Zuemo had been pregnant for several months and could not do strenuous exercise, but she still needed to walk more on weekdays. Li Yi walked with her for a while after dinner, accompanied her to Su Fuji's shop to taste a few new pastries, and then sent her back to her room to rest. Wei Liang sat outside with a pair of binoculars in his hand, staring at the street for a long time. If it wasn't for the fact that his other hand was not moving back and forth rhythmically where it shouldn't be placed, Li Yi would definitely think that he was doing something dirty. When Wei Liang put down the binoculars, he found Li Yi standing beside him and said with a face full of amazement, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla, if this thing is used on the battlefield, won't you be able to see the movements of the enemy from miles away with your own eyes? Li Yi felt a little sad for the people of the Wu kingdom. Binoculars had long been equipped in the army of the Jing kingdom. As a general guarding the border, Wei Liang's position was not low, but he had not even heard of it. Thinking that even the princes of the Wu kingdom would stand on the street and drool over candied fruits, all of this was not surprising. Do you like it? If you do, I'll give it to you. Li Yi was not a stingy person. The cost of this thing was not high. It was made from glass, so how much could it be worth? All the children in the stockade had started to play with glass marbles. For me? Wei Liang was stunned and his voice trembled as he spoke. Li Yi nodded, for you? Wei Liang's expression was extremely conflicted. After a while he said with difficulty, no, this is too expensive. I can't accept it. Li Yi waved his hand and did not explain. He walked straight into the prince's mansion. Wei Liang held this magical tool that he named All-Seeing Eyes in his hand. It felt extremely unreal. Did this thing really belong to him now? After a while he finally accepted reality. His eyes were filled with respect and gratitude as he looked forward, even though that figure had long disappeared. His Highness Jianghu of Silla was really a very good person. Zuemo was resting in the room. Rui and Ruoqing went out. Li Yi strolled around the mansion. When he walked to the door of Yang Liuqing's courtyard, he stopped, turned around and walked in. She was now able to do a little exercise and was doing some recovery movements in the yard. Yang Fu was also in the yard, squatting at the door of the room to play with the crickets. When he saw Li Yi come in, his whole body shivered. He looked at his sister in the yard and was relieved. Uncle Master. Li Yi waved at Yang Liuqing, indicating that she did not need to be polite. Old man Wang was also in the yard. He seemed to be talking to Yang Liuqing about something. When he saw Li Yi come in, he nodded slightly but did not say anything. Li Yi looked at her and said, I came to say that the weather is getting cold now. In a few days we will go back to Shuzhou. You should get ready and go back together. Yang Liuqing nodded gently and said, well, I know. That's all. Li Yi glanced at Yang Fu at the door and said, I'm leaving. Uncle Master. When he walked to the door, a voice suddenly sounded in his ear. Li Yi could hear that Yang Liuqing's voice was a little hesitant. He turned to look at her and asked, is there anything else? There was a hint of hesitation on Yang Liuqing's face. She bit her lip gently, then looked up at Li Yi and said, I have a presumptuous request. Li Yi asked doubtfully, what presumptuous request? Li Yi looked at her and found that her face was a little red. She spoke hesitantly as if she wanted to say something extremely embarrassing. He suddenly froze in place and thought to himself, it can't be, he was her uncle master. There was a gap in seniority between them. Rui would spank his butt until it was swollen. Uncle Master, what do you think of Yang Fu? Li Yi looked at Yang Liuqing and was stunned for a moment. Then he came back to his senses and said, he's okay, compared to Prince Jin Li Han? Compared to Li Han, this was a bit of a blow. Yang Liuqing looked at him and said, "In fact, although Yang Fu is a little naughty, his nature is not bad." Before she finished speaking, Yang Fu, who was squatting at the door and playing with the crickets, suddenly jumped up. His face was full of anger. He pointed at a maid who had just finished cleaning the room and came out of the room and angrily scolded, "Don't you have eyes? Didn't you see my mighty general? If we were in the Wu Kingdom, I would have already sent someone to chop off your head." The maid who accidentally stepped on the crickets turned pale and trembled all over. Li walked over and patted the maid's shoulder. He smiled and said, "It's okay. You can leave first." After the maid left, he looked at Yang Fu. The latter immediately took a few steps back and said in panic, What do you want to do?" Li only glanced at him and ignored him. He walked into the courtyard and looked at Yang Liuqing and asked, "What did you want to say just now?" Chapter 1057. With a pained expression, Yang Fu threw the cricket that was stomped to death by the maidservant aside and said proudly, "Luckily I caught a state guarding general that was even more powerful than the mighty general yesterday." Yang Liuqing looked at him, clenching and unclenching his fists. His eyes were filled with disappointment. Elder Wang sighed and looked up at the sky. Yang Liuqing took a deep breath and looked at Li Yi apologetically. She said in a low voice, "I'm sorry, Uncle Master. It's fine now, we're family. There's no need to apologize." Li Yi waved his hand and turned to leave. "Yang Fu." Yang Liuqing walked up to the young man who was playing with the cricket. Yang Fu looked up at her. Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked, "Have you finished today's math problems?" Yang Fu immediately nodded and said, "I finished today's 2 problems." "Very good." Yang Liuqing patted his head and said, "My royal sister will reward you with 10 more problems. Go and solve them. You can eat after you're done." Hearing this, Yang Fu's body trembled. He raised his head and looked at his royal sister who spoiled him the most. He suddenly felt that at this moment she was so unfamiliar. Unfamiliar yet familiar at the same time. His face was pale and his body was trembling. "Oh no, my royal sister must have been possessed. She must have been possessed by that bastard." He cried, heartbroken and heartbroken. "I don't want to write. I want to go back. I don't want to stay in this place anymore." After moving back to Shuzhou from the fringe, Li Yi had not seen the young man named Yang Fu. According to Wei Liang, His Highness King Jing had been in seclusion for the past 2 months, painstakingly studying mathematics. He must have made great progress. Otherwise, he wouldn't have cried tears of joy in the middle of the night. His cries could be heard from a courtyard away. For the first time, Li Yi admired Yang Fu. When Li Duan first started studying mathematics, he cried a lot. When he encountered a difficult problem, he could not solve it even after a long time. He cried even sadder than Li Duan when he was only a few months old. Yang Fu could actually cry tears of joy. He was simply the chosen one. Yang Liuqing's injuries were almost healed. She didn't mention anything about revenge anymore. She stayed by Mississippi Lu's side every day to help her deal with Lu Meng's matters. Everything seemed to have returned to normal, no different from a few years ago. Li Yi would occasionally see her sitting in the courtyard in a daze. Her eyes were blank, unfocused, and without direction. She was like a lost child, unable to find the way forward or the way back. Of course, when she was in front of others, she would put away all these emotions. No one knew how heavy her heart was. Wu Kingdom spies came back with some more news. Li Yi personally brought it to her. In fact, there wasn't any valuable news. Wu Kingdom was still as chaotic as before. The warlords were divided and engaged in a tug-of-war with the imperial court. If there were no accidents, this situation would continue for a long time. But no news was good news for her. The border armies that were loyal to her had been scattered a few months ago. If they were captured by the imperial court, in order to serve as a deterrent, they would definitely spread the news with great fanfare. If there was no news, at least it meant that they were living in harmony. After reading the news, Yang Liuqing's mood rose slightly. She bowed and said, "Thank you, Martial Uncle." Li Yi waved his hand. "You're welcome." Yang Fu walked out of the room and asked in a low voice, "Imperial sister, I finished my homework for today. Can I go out and play?" Yang Liuqing nodded. "Go ahead." Seeing Yang Fu run out, she looked at Li Yi. Her lips moved, but she didn't say anything. Li Yi looked at her and said in surprise, "Do you have something to say to me?" Yang Liuqing pondered for a long time. Then she looked at Li Yi and said with some begging, Can I hand Yang Fu over to Martial Uncle to discipline for a period of time?" Li Yi could understand how she felt when she said this. Yang Fu was her and these people's only hope. With Yang Fu around, they would have enough reason to resist the imperial court of Wu Kingdom. Only then would they have a reason to pull down the emperor of Wu Kingdom from the throne and help Yang Fu onto it. But this couldn't be their one-sided wish. If they could succeed in the end, Yang Fu would definitely sit on the throne. But the reality was that this emperor was somewhat unworthy of being helped up. When he was born, there was no red light, no colorful glow, no auspicious clouds, no beautiful stars, no auspicious clouds, no emperor's aura, no black dragon coming out of the water, no phoenix crying over the mountain, no white rainbow piercing the sun, and no sweet dew falling on the ground. His mother didn't carry him for 3 years, so he couldn't speak at birth. His appearance was also normal. He didn't have double pupils for breasts, long hands, a square face, and the lines on his hands and feet couldn't be written. There was no Yang Fu will be the emperor in the future written on it. He was just King Jing, a very ordinary prince. From birth until now, he didn't have the appearance of an emperor at all, nor did he have the fate of an overlord. But he had a very good temper. Even if this kind of person became the emperor in the future and wanted to brag about how awesome and extraordinary he was before he became the emperor, he couldn't find any material. So Old Man Wang sighed all day and Yang Liuqing was also unhappy. As martial uncle, Li Yi felt sorry for her. It's not that I can't discipline him. Li Yi nodded and said, it's just that my method might be a little different. I'm worried, martial uncle, you agree? Yang Liuqing grabbed his arm and said in surprise. Looking at her hand that was grabbing his arm, Li Yi blushed. He looked around and said, don't be like this. It's not good if your master sees it. I'm sorry, martial uncle, I'm too happy. Yang Liuqing hurriedly let go of him and said, as long as you agree to discipline Yang Fu, I'll agree to any condition, and I definitely won't interfere with you. Li Yi secretly sighed and felt a little sad for Yang Fu. How could there be such a sister in the world? Wasn't she pushing her brother into the fire pit? Wasn't she not giving Yang Fu a way out? Were the two of them really siblings? Yang Fu was different from other children. He was a member of the royal family of the Wu Kingdom, a noble prince. Other children gathered in groups of 3 to 5, playing with spinning tops, playing with glass beads, fanning pictures, shooting birds with slingshots, and competing to see who could pee further. Yang Fu always played by himself. There were 2 reasons why he played by himself. First, he was self-conscious of his status and was unwilling to be friends with these lowly commoners in his eyes, nor was he willing to play with them. Second, he had offended Fat Tiger on the first day he came here. Fat Tiger was the king of the children here. If he offended the king, the children would be kind enough not to beat him up. No one was willing to play with him. Therefore, the 14-year-old Yang Fu could only play with mud by himself. Li Yi couldn't bear to tell him that the place he played with mud was where Fat Tiger and the others competed to see who could pee further. Who hadn't played with mud when they were young? Yang Liuqing walked out of the courtyard and said to Yang Fu, come here. Yang Fu raised his head to take a look. His royal sister seemed to be very happy. It had been a long time since she had been this happy. If his royal sister was happy, he should also be happy in his heart, but why did he feel a chill in his heart, and the surroundings were a little cold? He stood up and slowly walked over, obediently calling out, royal sister. Then, he quietly moved away from the person beside his royal sister. I have something to tell you. Yang Liuqing glanced at Li Yi who was beside her before looking at him and saying, from now on, you must listen to Uncle Master's words. Whatever Uncle Master asks you to do, you must do it. You must listen to Uncle Master's words just like how you listen to me. Yang Fu's body trembled and his face turned pale. He knew who his royal sister's Uncle Master was. It was the person he feared the most, second only to his second brother. He shook his head fiercely, his attitude firm. I don't want to listen to him, I don't want to listen to him. Yang Fu, Yang Liuqing said in a deep voice. Yang Fu shivered and his voice came to an abrupt stop. His royal sister was his only family in this world, so he had to listen to her. Yang Liuqing looked at him and said, call me mister. Yang Fu looked up at Li Yi with a stubborn expression. He opened his mouth but nothing came out. Li Yi waved his hand and said with a smile, there's no need to call me mister. He was willing to help Yang Liuqing discipline Yang Fu because he didn't want to refuse her and he didn't want to make her sad. He also didn't want to teach Yang Fu knowledge, but he wanted him to change some of the bad habits he had developed for a long time, so that he could become a person that most people didn't dislike. Every time he heard the word mister, the only thing that would appear in his mind would be the girl's tearful smile before they parted, and the figure standing on the palace wall. So, after leaving the capital, he wouldn't accept any more disciples and he wouldn't let anyone call him Mr. Jianghu wasn't and no one else would be. Chapter 1058. If Uncle did not want Jianghu to call him Mr., it meant that he would not accept him as a disciple. Yang Liuqing was a little disappointed, but she knew that Jianghu was still far from being qualified to be Uncle's disciple. She looked at Jianghu and said seriously, "You have to listen to Uncle's words just like you listen to me. If I find out that you have disobeyed Uncle's orders, I will not have you as my brother anymore." Jianghu shivered and said hurriedly, "Sister, I understand. I will be obedient." Yang Liuqing looked at him. A trace of pity flashed in her eyes, but it quickly disappeared. She knew that her words were a little harsh, but this was the only chance to change him. She looked at Li Yi and said gratefully, "Uncle, I will hand Jianghu over to you." Li Yi nodded and said, "He is still a child. It is normal for him to be a little naughty. As long as you guide him patiently, he will be able to correct his shortcomings." He said guide, but Jianghu's heart did not relax. He said that he would reward him, but in the end he gave him a very difficult book, elementary mathematics. Did he mean to guide him by beating him up? Yang Liuqing bowed and said, "Thank you, Uncle." Li actually did not have much experience in teaching naughty children. He felt that it was more straightforward to beat the child. However, of course he could not beat Jianghu. That would be bullying the young and he would never do such a thing. Mississippi Lu walked into the study and looked at Jianghu who was sitting at the desk. She then looked at Li Yi and asked, "Did you accept him as your disciple?" "No." Li Yi shook his head and said, "I only promised your disciple to help her discipline her brother for a few days." "You even know how to discipline people?" Mississippi Lu looked doubtful. He could not even discipline himself, how would he know how to discipline others? "What's so difficult about it?" Li Yi looked at her and said, "If a child is disobedient, just beat him up. What's there to discipline?" Jianghu, who had just written down an equation, shook his hand, and a blob of ink immediately appeared on the paper. His hand that was holding the pen trembled slightly. He had clearly promised his royal sister that he would guide her. How could he hit him? He was still a child. How could he not keep his word? "Hurry up and write. You can only eat after you finish." Li Yi looked at Jianghu and reminded him before walking out of the study. There was no point in trying to reason with him. He would not listen, nor would he be willing to listen. Therefore he would assign tasks to Jianghu every day. It might be homework, it might be for him to help out at a certain shop, or it might be for him to make friends with Fat Tiger and win 10 glass beads from Fat Tiger. He couldn't eat if he didn't complete the task. In order not to starve, he had to do things he didn't want to do. For a child of Jianghu's background, it was not strange for him to develop a proud and aloof personality. In the royal family of the Jing kingdom, there were many princes who were arrogant. Although Li Han used to be naughty, his nature was not bad. He could be considered as a clean stream. For a muddy water like Jianghu, it had to go through layers of filtering to make him forget his identity as a prince and adapt to being an ordinary person. Which was more important, eating or identity? He definitely had a clear idea. Mississippi Lu hugged her sword and leaned against the pillar. Li stood at the door and looked at her. Li watched for a while and asked, "Thinking about your disciple?" Mississippi Lu did not deny it. She said, "How difficult is it to do what they want to do?" "Almost impossible." In front of Rui, Li did not need to hide. He said, "Even if you are willing to help her, it is almost impossible. Moreover, it will take a lot of time and many people will die. Many innocent and irrelevant people will die. Even so, the chance of success is still very small. If rebellion was so easy to succeed, wouldn't the change of dynasties be as frequent as the change of lovers between scumbags? The history of the Wu kingdom was longer than that of the Jing kingdom. It had occupied that land for more than 100 years. How could the regime be so easily overthrown? Li looked at her and said, "The price of rebellion is too high, and the success rate is too low. If you can persuade her to give up on this idea, it will be the best." The emperor of Wu country had a blood feud with Yang Liuqing. As a martial uncle who was not related to her, it was not appropriate for him to advise her to give up on revenge. Second, young Mistress Lu was her teacher, her biological teacher. Only she had the right to say this. Mississippi Lu looked at him and asked, "If they go back now and start planning again, what are the chances of success?" "Not even 5%. What if we lend them divine punishment and weapons?" Divine punishment is not omnipotent. No matter how sharp the weapons are, they can't be used if they are not strong enough. Just 5%. What if we have Lu Meng's help? On the battlefield, the strength of an individual will be infinitely weakened. 10%, no more than 10%. Even if we are lucky to succeed, Lu Meng won't have many people left. Mississippi Lu thought for a while and continued to ask, what if I am her? Li was stunned. He looked at her and asked, you mean you are Yang Liuqing, the emperor of the Wu kingdom who killed our father and forced our mother to death? Mississippi Lu nodded. Li thought for a moment and a smile appeared on his face. Hee, I finished writing? Yang Fu walked out of the study with a notebook. As soon as he opened his mouth, he saw the smile on Li Yi's face. He couldn't help but shiver and his hair stood on end. He forcibly swallowed the words he wanted to say. He quickly turned around and ran back to his seat. His body was trembling and his palms were sweaty. Mississippi Lu was basically asking how likely it was if he wanted to rebel. He had once helped the king of Shu rebel. The one-eyed stone man, the fish belly silk book, the fox spirit, the nursery rhymes. These were all Rebellion 1.0. Now it had been upgraded to Rainbow in Broad Daylight, the version 2.0 that came with the rainbow glow. As someone who was familiar with all kinds of revolutionary routines and was familiar with tunnel warfare, landmine warfare, guerrilla warfare, and on protracted war, he understood the united front, armed struggle, and knew that the country was surrounded by the city. He rolled up his sleeves and worked hard. At most, in 5 years at most, the Wu kingdom would change its surname to Li or Lu. Of course, if he only wanted to take revenge, no matter who the emperor was, he just needed to ask second granduncle to take the head of the emperor. Mississippi Lu crossed her arms and asked, if you want to rebel, how many people will be left in the Lu Meng? Li looked at her and said in surprise, if I want to rebel, then I want to rebel. What does it have to do with the Lu Meng? At this point there was no need to continue. Mississippi Lu had already gotten the answer she wanted. Li didn't want to lie to Rui. If he really wanted to rebel against the Wu kingdom wholeheartedly, even if he wasn't 100% sure, he had at least an 80% chance of success. The Wu kingdom was not like the Jing kingdom, which was as solid as an iron bucket. In fact, it was not even comparable to the current Qi kingdom. The Wu kingdom itself was on the verge of falling apart. Warlords rose up and the common people were displaced. The Wu kingdom was in dire straits and oppression was everywhere. From a historical point of view, it was very likely that a great man who could change the dynasty would emerge at this time. Li really didn't have much confidence that he could rebel in the Jing kingdom. But the Wu kingdom, he could write a letter to Li Xian and ask him to provide international assistance. Li Xian never thought it was a big deal. He could also shine the glory of the empress to the Wu kingdom and save the people of the Wu kingdom. He could also conquer the warlords of the Wu kingdom one by one, just like he conquered the chaotic land. If they didn't obey him, he could use divine punishment and cannon to crush them. He really didn't need the Lu Meng. But he didn't have any reason to do so. Was it just to help Yang Liuqing take revenge? If it was just revenge, Li could even ask second granduncle to take the head of the emperor of the Wu kingdom at the price of several chickens. However, they wanted to rebel and push Yang Fu onto the throne. Then what? Li Yi felt that the emperor of the Wu kingdom might not be very grateful to him. For example, now for no reason the emperor had an inexplicable hostility towards him. Yang Liuqing was his martial nephew, but he wouldn't use Rui, Li Duan, and Ruoqing Zumo as the wager for his martial nephew. He believed in Yang Liuqing, but he didn't believe in Yang Fu. Mississippi Lu's assumption didn't work, so all the questions she asked based on this had no answer. Chapter 1059. In just half a month, Yang Fu had changed a lot. Every day he would take the initiative to complete his homework. When he saw trash on the ground, he would bend over to pick it up and place it in the trash can. When it rained, he would help the people living on the street to collect the clothes that had not been collected in time. Helping the elderly cross the road was a common occurrence for him. In fact, Li Yi did not have strict requirements for him. Compared with Li Han, Yang Fu's life was simply too happy. He only needed to complete the homework that old Wang gave him, and then do 10 good deeds every day. He needed to do 10 good deeds every day to ensure that he would have food to eat the next day. If he did 10 good deeds, he would eat vegetables and rice. If he did not do 10 good deeds, he could only choose to eat soil or tree bark. Only by exceeding the minimum standards set by Li Yi could he have the right to eat meat. Of course, he also had other choices. Eating tree bark in the village was an act of vandalism. Once he was caught by the law enforcement team, he would be grounded. Being grounded would give him steamed buns, which was better than eating tree bark and soil. However, Jianghu had not thought of this yet. Habit was a terrible thing. Whether he was willing or not, even if he pretended to do all these good deeds, as long as he could keep pretending, he would be worthy of the title of Top 10 Young Men of Willow Village. The name of the village, Li, followed the name of Willow Village in Qing'an Prefecture. It was also in the mountains, and they also had the blood of bandits. It would more or less make Rui and the others feel a little bit like home. Jianghu was the new Top 10 Young Men of Willow Village. It was not easy to get this title. The children in the village were all full of energy, or maybe their parents were full of energy. To get this title, Jianghu had to exceed or double the task that Li gave him. Whether he did it for King Jing's face or to not starve, at least on the surface, he was not as naughty as before. Jianghu did not know when his sense of superiority disappeared. He could play glass beads with Fat Tiger and the others, fan pictures, and compete on the mountain to see who could pee further. Of course, he was usually the one who lost, especially in the last round. After the competition, he looked very sad, as if his self-esteem had suffered a great blow. Yang Liuqing and Prime Minister Wang noticed Jianghu's change. Elder Wang looked at Jianghu, who was picking up the trash on the ground and throwing it into the trash can. He sighed and said, "I've been teaching for my entire life and nurturing people for my entire life, but I'm still not as thorough as a young man." Yang Liuqing comforted him. Even the Wengu from the Qi Kingdom, who is well versed in Confucian classics and has students all over the world, has lost to Uncle Master. Prime Minister, you don't have to worry too much. Her Royal Highness's way of comforting people was very unique. The old man surnamed Wang was stunned for a long time before he sighed and said, "Jiang of Silla knows everything and knows everything." "It's a pity?" Yang Liuqing looked at him and asked doubtfully, "What's a pity?" "Nothing much." As Yang Liuqing walked towards Jianghu, the old man looked in that direction and murmured, "It's a pity that he isn't willing to help King Jing." Li had long passed the stage of being a good teacher. In other words, he had never been a good teacher. What would happen if he taught an emperor? Would an emperor come looking for trouble with him? Not all emperors in this world were as stupid as Li Xian. Not all of them were so free that they would abandon their own families to help others rebel. When he first came here, he could be fearless when he didn't even have enough to eat. But now he couldn't. Li Duan was only 3 years old now. The child in Zue Mo's belly hadn't been born yet. He and Ruoqing didn't have a child yet. The longer he stayed here, the more he was afraid of death. He would first consider the risk before doing anything. He wouldn't do anything that was difficult and dangerous without any benefits. Although Rui didn't say it explicitly, they had been in cahoots for so long. They would always think of these things together. What was the point of rebelling? It was better to hug Yongning and listen to her talk about her childhood than to rebel. Yongning had told these things many times, and he had also heard them many times. Yongning never got tired of talking, and he never got tired of listening. 2 days ago it rained and thundered at night. Yongning ran to him in Rui's room barefoot. Rui hugged her and coaxed her for a long time before she fell asleep. A few days before the weather cleared, she slept with Rui. She looked up at Li Yi and murmured, "Brother, I miss Royal Sister. In the past, when there was thunder, it was Royal Sister who hugged me to sleep." Li Yi couldn't continue her words. He patted her head and said, "In the future, if you're afraid at night, go find Sister Rui or Sister Xiao Huan to sleep with you." Yongning nodded and looked at Li Yi. "But I still miss Royal Sister Shaning." Li suddenly felt something cold at the tip of his nose. He looked up and saw snowflakes falling from the gray sky. "It's snowing." Yongning jumped out of his arms with a happy expression on her face. She stretched out her arms and spun around in the courtyard. Shu Province didn't have snow every year. Although it wasn't rare, almost everyone looked forward to the first snow every winter. This was also the cleanest snow of the entire winter. In her previous life, Yongning was born in a province in the south, and it was only after she arrived here that she had seen snow. Although snow was no longer that rare to her, she was still very excited every time it snowed. This snowfall was very heavy and fast. The ground was soon covered with a thin layer of snow. However, if she wanted to build a snowman and have a snowball fight, she would have to wait until tomorrow at the very least. After this snowfall, the new year was approaching. Time was about to enter the second year of Jingping, the capital. On the 23rd of the 12th month, when Li Xian walked out of his room, he discovered that a heavy snow had silently fallen last night. Hibiscus Garden's hair had turned white overnight. Soon it would be another year's court conference. However, as the emperor he wasn't that busy. It was good to have Emingzu in court. If he had to handle all these things alone he would definitely be flustered. He wouldn't be able to attend to the matters of the Academy of Sciences. However, it was impossible for Emingzu to help him forever. Ever since she started to limit the number of memorials submitted by the various departments of the court and gradually reduced it. Now, it had become one every 3 days unless it was an emergency. At that time, he knew that she would have to leave sooner or later. He couldn't blame Emingzu. In fact, he felt that he was a little selfish. If it wasn't for the restraints of the court, she might still be having fun with Li Yi. Thinking about it carefully, it seemed that he had really let her down. In the morning, a thick layer of snow had fallen in Hibiscus Garden. There were guards patrolling the palace from morning till night. The ground had been trampled out of shape. It was a little disappointing. He walked through the long corridor alone and headed in the direction of the Imperial Garden. There were many Imperial Gardens in the capital. Besides the Imperial Palace, there were also Hibiscus Garden and Xiujiang Garden. Comparatively speaking, Hibiscus Garden's garden was the largest and the most beautiful. Everyone in the capital knew that the plum blossoms in Cold Mountain Temple were unique. Every year, countless people would go to see them. However, only a few people knew that the plum forest in Hibiscus Garden was not inferior to the plum blossoms in Cold Mountain Temple. It was just that other than a few members of the imperial family, no one else could enjoy the scenery in the garden. Leaving the first set of footprints in the snow-covered, spotless garden was something that gave him a sense of accomplishment. Li Xian walked to the entrance of the garden. When he saw that there was already a line of footprints extending into the garden, he immediately felt depressed. He walked into the plum forest and followed the footprints. When he saw the figure standing under the largest plum tree in the garden, the depression in his heart was swept away. He slowly walked over and softly asked, "Why did you wake up so early?" The girl was wearing a white robe. When she heard the voice, she turned her head and smiled. She said, "I woke up early. I couldn't sleep, so I got up and took a walk." Li Xian looked up and saw a red ribbon tied to a plum tree branch. Shanning would come here every day to tie a red ribbon. Now there were hundreds of red ribbons. From afar, the ribbons on the plum tree danced in the wind, adding some embellishment to the white world. It was the most unique scenery in this plum forest. He looked at the girl's elegant smile and thought to himself, "What a heartless fellow. He actually made me wait for so long in the capital and didn't even know to come back." He only had a vague idea of what he had done to Shuzhou. He also heard that he had conquered the entire land of chaos. Such an interesting thing, but he couldn't participate in it personally. He thought for a moment and suddenly said, "After the imperial court meeting, your sister and I plan to go to Shuzhou. We are going to patrol incognito. Does Shanning want to go with us?" The girl was startled. She suddenly raised her head and her face blushed. Her voice trembled as she said, Shuzhou." Li Xian nodded. I have to go back and ask mother." The girl's face instantly turned red and she quickly ran out of the garden. She ran in such a hurry that she didn't pay attention to her feet and accidentally tripped. Li Xian hurriedly went forward to help her up. However, the girl had already gotten up on her own. She didn't even have time to brush off the snow on her body. She staggered and jogged outside. When her figure completely disappeared, Li Xian sighed and said leisurely, "It's time to do an incognito visit." Chapter 1060. Hibiscus Garden was the largest royal garden in the capital aside from the imperial palace. Ever since His Majesty ascended to the throne, he had spent more time in Hibiscus Garden than in the imperial palace. The eldest princess, who had been promoted from assistant to head the government, also lived in Hibiscus Garden. Apart from the morning court session that was held every 7 days in the legislative hall, for the past 2 years, most of the memorials submitted by the various departments of the court were also sent to Hibiscus Garden. After the renovation of Hibiscus Garden, a few new palaces were built and the palace complex was expanded. His Majesty the Empress and Imperial Consort, the Empress Dowager, the eldest princess, and Princess Shanning all lived there. In the past 2 years, Hibiscus Garden seemed to be replacing the Imperial Palace. The officials were now used to not clashing with His Majesty on such matters. His Majesty lived wherever he liked. Even when His Majesty brought the Empress Dowager and Imperial Consort Yen over, no censor said anything, and no official from the Ministry of Rights said it was inappropriate. Ever since the matter of the Jianghu of Silla came to an end, Prime Minister Qin retired, and Prime Minister Shin retired from the court. All the big shots in the court were promoted by His Majesty and eldest princess. The relationship between the emperor and his officials was particularly harmonious. Hibiscus Garden, Shaoling Palace. Shaoling Palace was the residence of Imperial Consort Yan. The Imperial Consort Yan mentioned here was not the current emperor's consort. The current emperor only had two consorts, the Empress and Imperial Consort Yan. Imperial Consort Yan was the former emperor's consort and the only one other than the empress who did not have to live in a fixed residence in the imperial palace. By the window of the small pavilion, heavy snow was falling outside. The fire in the room was burning brightly without a trace of cold air. Imperial Consort Yan leaned against the window, holding a scroll in her hand. At some point she looked down and saw a girl stumbling over from afar. A palace maid walked over slowly and said softly, "Imperial Consort, the princess is back." "I saw her." Imperial Consort Yan nodded. The girl had already gone upstairs. The palace maid hurriedly took the snow-stained robe. The girl took off her shoes, jumped onto the bed and burrowed under the covers. She rubbed her little hands vigorously, and her delicate little face was red from the cold. Concubine Yan put down the scroll and held her two small hands in her hands. She asked, "It's snowing heavily. What are you doing out so early in the morning? Did you fall just now?" Her hand was held by her mother. She said with a smile, "The plum blossoms in Furong Garden are in full bloom. They're even more beautiful than those in Cold Mountain Temple. I'll accompany you to take a look in the afternoon." Yan Fei touched her hair and said, "Tell me what's the matter. Why did you come back in such a hurry?" The girl lowered her head and said in a low voice, "Brother and sister are going to Shuzhou. They are going to patrol in disguise. Go if you want to." Concubine Yan patted her head and said with a smile, "But, no buts." Concubine Yan shook her head and said, "The capital is so small. I have to go out and see more scenery and meet the people I want to meet. Then I'll make arrangements for the academy and the association first." The girl hurriedly lifted the blanket and jumped off the bed. She put on her shoes and quickly disappeared into the small building. Concubine Yan leaned against the window and watched as the figure hurriedly ran into the snow and quickly disappeared. She picked up the scroll again and thought for a moment. Then she picked up the brush and added a few words at the back before putting the scroll down. She opened the window, and the wind blew in from outside, blowing the scroll she had placed in front of the window. The cover of the book was blown open, revealing a few small and graceful words. "Mandarin duck handkerchief." The cold wind swept in a few snowflakes. She stretched out a hand and a snowflake landed on her palm. A smile appeared at the corner of her mouth, and she slowly clenched her fist. The snowflakes melted, but she seemed to be clenching something tightly. In the Jianghu of Silla residence, Li Yi tightened his clothes. It was already past the new year, but the weather was getting colder and colder. The gray sky with snowflakes made it hard for people to breathe, as if their hearts were being clenched tightly. He was so envious of Rui and Rui. When could he be like them and not be affected by the cold and heat? He walked outside and saw Yang Fu playing a role-playing game with Fat Tiger and the others. The current Yang Fu no longer had the airs of a prince and could already mingle with them. Fat Tiger looked at Yang Fu, who was lying on the ground, and laughed loudly. "Haha, monkey son, no matter how powerful you are, you can't escape from the palms of Buddha Gautama." Yang Fu's face was filled with grief and indignation as he shouted, "Jade Emperor Gautama, I old son was deceived by you. I was deceived by you." There were brothels in the village that didn't charge money. They would go to the theater when they had time, and their favorite was Journey to the West. To children this show would never go out of style. Even the 3-year-old Li Duan could watch it with relish. Over the past few months he no longer had many restrictions on Yang Fu. A leopard could not change its spots. Li couldn't guarantee that Yang Fu had turned over a new leaf and awakened some strange overlord attribute that could make the people submit to him with a stomp of his feet, make the emperor of the Wu kingdom bow down to him, give up the throne, and cut off his own head. However, his arrogant and willful personality was nowhere to be seen, and he was no longer as annoying as before. Li Yi felt that his mission had been completed, and he could report to Yang Liuqing now. This period of time could be considered the most stable period of his life in Shuzhou. The various reforms in Shuzhou had passed the most difficult stage, and what followed was a long period of development. With Chen Chong keeping an eye on everything, there wouldn't be any problems. The Land of Chaos had also officially changed its surname to Lu, and it was also in a stable stage of development. Wang Wei was leading a group of people to roll up their sleeves and start construction. All they needed was time. Drunk Mo's due date was the end of February, and there was less than half a month left. With Ruoqing and Rui by her side, she had been in a good mood. Ever since she started practicing martial arts, her physique had become much stronger than before. With a professional delivery team, she didn't have to worry too much. Fang walked in from outside. Li looked at him, but before he could speak, Fang shook his head and said, "No." He meant that there was no letter from him. Li Xian hadn't replied to him for almost 3 months. Not only Li Xian but Emingzu and Shanning also didn't reply. The letters he sent out were like stones sinking into the ocean, and there was no reply. No reply, right? He wouldn't write any letters this month either. He would reply when he received his letter. Who's afraid of who, mister? When Li Yi was sitting in the courtyard in a daze, he suddenly heard a familiar voice. This voice was too familiar, so familiar that he could recognize it with his bones. However, he hadn't heard this voice for a long time. Yang Fu wouldn't call him that. In the entire Shuzhou, in the entire Jing kingdom, no one else would call him that. Li Yi raised his head and looked at the girl standing at the door, looking at him in a daze. He suddenly stood up. Because he used too much strength, the stone chair he was sitting on was directly overturned by him. He looked at the girl, turned around and picked up the stone chair. He sighed and sat down again. He had been looking forward to their reply for the past 2 days. He had actually been hallucinating. How could he be in Shuzhou? How could he see Shou Ning in King Jing's imperial residence? Mr. Crack. Li Yi broke the armrest of the stone chair. He stood up in disbelief and said, "Shanning, you, how could you?" The girl ran over but stopped halfway. Her eyes were full of tears, but there was a smile on her face. She said, "I missed you, mister, so I came to see you." When she ran over, Li Yi clearly saw the excitement in her eyes. He didn't know why she stopped. He thought for a moment and stretched out his arms. The girl was startled and then she rushed forward. Li Yi was knocked back a few steps by her. "Mister, I'm so happy." She hung on his body like a koala, holding his neck. He didn't know whether she was crying or laughing. He could only hear her vague murmurs. Li Xian walked in quickly from the door. He looked at Li Yi and laughed. "You didn't expect this, did you?" Shanning hurriedly got down from him, wiped her tears, and stood aside in a very ladylike manner. As Li Xian walked over, he stretched out his arms and said, "Long time no see." Li Yi brushed past him and walked to the door. He said in surprise, "Where's Emingzu? Why didn't Emingzu come?" Chapter 1061. Emingzu. Li Xian was not angry at being ignored at all. A trace of embarrassment appeared on his face as he said, "Emingzu is busy with state affairs and doesn't have time to come over." Li Yi looked at Li Xian. 2 years had passed. Although his appearance and temperament had not changed much, the words he said were not like the Li Xian he knew. As the ruler of a country, he could stroll from the capital to Shuzhou, but he said that Emingzu was busy with state affairs. Was this something he could say as an emperor? Was this something a person could say? Li Yi finally couldn't help but ask, "When did you become so shameless?" "You flatter me." Li Xian cupped his hands and said, "I only learned half of your skills." Li Xian was being overly modest. "What 5%? It was at least 50%. Li Yi looked at him and asked, "Did you say she was busy with state affairs or did she say it herself?" Li Xian glanced at him and didn't answer. Instead he asked, "If you want to see her so much, why don't you go back to the capital to see her?" This conversation could not continue. Li Yi turned around. If he had time to chat with Li Xian, he might as well see if Shanning had grown taller and fatter. A girl changes 18 times between childhood and womanhood. After not seeing her for nearly 2 years, although she did not gain weight, she did grow a lot taller. Before she could not reach his chin, but now she could reach his nose. Xiaonyang. Li Duan ran out of the room and threw himself into Shanning's arms with open arms. Li Xian looked at him and asked, "What did your Li Duan say just now?" "Fragrant." Li Yi thought about it and said, maybe he was talking about the fragrance on her body. Royal sister. She had just put Li Duan down when Yongning pounced on her. Shanning had spent a long time with her. Other than Li Yi, she was the closest person to Yongning in this world. Li Duan and Yongning walked around Shanning. Li Xian looked around and asked, "Can't anyone see me?" Yongning walked over with a red face and said softly, "Imperial brother." When Li Duan saw Li Xian, he quickly ran over. Li Xian squatted down and smiled. "Dwainer is still the best." Li Duan ran to Li Xian's side, looked around and asked in disappointment, "Xiao Rui didn't come?" For an emperor to need to find a sense of presence like this, one couldn't say that no one would do it in the future, but Li Xian was definitely the first. This time he could be considered to be making a private visit in disguise. In truth, it didn't matter whether he was in disguise or not. There was no difference in the capital without Li Xian. Li Yi also didn't make a big fuss, only informing Qin Chong. In all of Shuzhou there weren't many people who recognized him. Although the shameless Li Xian had left Emingzu in the capital, and Li Yi was deeply resentful, Shanning had come here so he had to celebrate. Li Xian, he might as well bring him along. In the back garden of the estate, Li Yi had just started a fire. The servants of the estate were moving the things needed for the picnic to the side. Spring had just begun and today's weather was not bad. The cold of spring had passed and the sun was shining brightly. A picnic after a walk was just right. Drunk Ink couldn't get close to the fire, so she chatted with Rui and watching on the lawn in the distance. This estate of yours is not bad. Li Xian looked at the garden. The green grass was like a carpet, and the fragrance of flowers assailed his nostrils. A dozen paces ahead, a clear stream flowed by, the sound of water babbling. In terms of size, only the hibiscus garden and Xujiang Manor in the capital could compare. Li didn't reply. After Li Xian became emperor, this bad habit still hadn't changed. Everything was good from other people's homes. In the past few years he had stolen many good things from him. Fortunately he couldn't move this garden. There was no point in being envious, and even if he liked it, it would be a waste. When he started the fire, Shanning stood by his side, holding a fan in her hand, patiently fanning away the rising smoke. She had really changed a lot. Other than the hug when they first met, there was no longer a trace of the arrogant princess. Li Yi was a little happy but also a little sad. She had finally grown from a little girl to a big girl. This was something that a girl had to experience in her life, and it was also a normal transformation. However, the pain experienced in the process of transformation was often heart-wrenching. Mississippi Lu was teaching Yangliuking martial arts on the lawn in the distance. It was said that she had encountered a bottleneck, and if she could break through, she would enter a new level. This made Li Yi feel a little depressed. His strength was already about the same as Yangliuking's, and now she had to temporarily shake him off. Her ultimate goal was Mississippi Lu, Emingzu, and the 2 positions at the top of the heaven list. But now, not only could he not defeat the bare-breasted and bum Bai Su, he couldn't even defeat Mississippi Lu's disciple. As for Rui himself, he was worried that he would succumb to her despotic power for the rest of his life. Li Xian looked into the distance. At a certain moment he suddenly turned around and said, "Did you notice that your second miss is a little different from before?" If even Li Xian could see it, it meant that Rui had really changed a lot. A few years ago, Li didn't even dare to think that she could actually become so gentle and understanding. Li Xian moved closer to him and whispered, "Tell me honestly, have you secretly taken her down? Take your sister." He couldn't take Li Xian's sister for no reason, but he also couldn't let him be a hindrance here. He waved to Fong and said, "Show him your treasure." Fong was suddenly shocked. Why? Li Yi just wanted to send Li Xian away, so he looked at him and said, "Don't be so stingy." Fong thought for a moment, looked at him and asked, "Here?" "Of course he's gone far away," Li Yi said snappily. Although that thing was small, it was very powerful. If one was not careful, it would hurt people. It was safer to go far away. Fong thought for a moment, looked at Li Xian and said, "Come with me." Li Xian followed Fong to a tree in the distance. Seeing him start to untie his belt, he was shocked. "What are you trying to do?" Something fell from Fong's body. Li Xian looked at something on the ground and asked in surprise, "What is this?" Fong looked at the thing on the ground and seemed to understand something. He put on his belt and said proudly, "You haven't seen it before, right? This thing is called the Red Barbarian Cannon. Of course, this is a smaller version, but its power can't be underestimated." Fong picked up a copper tube and a pedestal-like thing and introduced it to Li Xian. "You won't understand even if I explain it to you like this." Li Xian watched as Fong picked up a green brick from the corner and placed it on the ground. Then he placed the strange thing called the Red Barbarian Cannon on the ground. After fiddling with it for a while, he took out a square box from his pocket. He took out a small stick from the square box and used the tip of the stick to scratch the side of the square box. Whoosh! A ball of flame appeared in Li Xian's eyes. "What is this thing?" Looking at Li Xian's shocked expression, Fong was startled and smiled. "I forgot to tell you. This is called a match. You haven't seen it before, right?" Li Xian really hadn't seen it before. He was the dignified emperor of the Jing Kingdom and the president of the Academy of Sciences. Other than Li Yi, he could be said to be the most knowledgeable person in the Jing kingdom, but today he was looked down upon. Not only that, he was looked down upon twice. Just like how he despised those stubborn and rotten scholars, he was actually despised by old Fang, who had never been educated. He suddenly felt that this trip was worth it. Otherwise, he might have missed out on a lot of interesting things. Seeing that Li Xian kept looking at the match in his hand, Fang's mouth pulled into a smile. To be able to despise an emperor made him feel a little accomplished. Li Xian looked at it and suddenly asked, "Is this real fire?" "Of course it is real," Fang said decisively. Li Xian stared at the match in his hand and asked, "Then why don't you feel any pain when your hand is burned?" Li Yi was listening to Shanning talk about her and Emingzi learning martial arts when he heard Fang's shout in the distance. He glanced in that direction. Wasn't it just to show the power of the mini cannon to Li Xian? Li Xian wasn't shocked, so why was he shouting? Chapter 1062. Bang. When Fang used the match to light the fuse, the strange thing he called the Red Barbarian Cannon disappeared in front of Li Xian. At the same time, the blue brick disappeared as well. The blue brick did not disappear, but was directly smashed into pieces. The scattered pieces fell to the side of Li Xian's feet. Fang ran to the bushes to pick up his treasure. Although this thing was small, exquisite, and powerful, the recoil was not small. Every time it was used, it would jump a few feet away by itself. Li Xian picked up a piece of the blue brick and put it under his nose to sniff it. He smelled the smell of God's punishment. Could God's punishment be used like this? The hard blue brick was simply too fragile in front of this little thing. If it was replaced with a human skull, it would not be much different. It was too fast, so fast that he could not see it clearly. This thing was too powerful. Although Li Xian's martial arts were not high, he estimated that even a martial arts master would not be able to defend against this thing. The mini cannon that had just been fired was a little hot. Fang put it aside to cool down, walked over and asked proudly, "How is it?" Li Xian looked at him and asked, "You just said that this is a smaller version. How big is the one that is not shrunk?" Fang thought about it and gestured a few times. He realized that he could not make a gesture at all. He shook his head and said, "In short, it is very big. You will know when you see it." Li Xian quickly walked to Li Yi's side. His eyes lit up and he said, "Give me one of these things. This is just a decoration. It is not very useful and it is also dangerous." Li Yi shook his head. The mini cannon was made by him for fun. Although it was powerful, the recoil was too strong. If an ordinary person held it in their hand, one shot would destroy their arm. Even someone as strong as Fang would not be able to handle it. He really did not dare to let Li Xian play with this thing. He also did not intend to let Li Xian study a normal-sized cannon. The Jing kingdom was still in the stage of stable development. They did not attack cities and territories. The Qi kingdom and the Zhao kingdom were now afraid of them. It was not very useful to have this thing, and God's punishment was enough. Of course, the most important thing was that they were now in the early stage of testing. Although there was a lot of information that could be consulted and used for reference, there was no guarantee that there would not be any mistakes. They had to slowly improve and perfect it. Li Xian sat on the grass and played with the treasure that Fang had just taken out. This thing could be considered a very powerful hidden weapon. Although after listening to Li Yi's explanation he already understood that this thing had a lot of limitations, it did not matter if it had shortcomings. If there were shortcomings, they could just improve it. This was what the Academy of Science did. Not afraid of difficulties, not afraid of hardships, and daring to make mistakes. These were the basic qualities that a scientific researcher must have. Fang stood beside Li Xian with a vigilant expression on his face. The more interested Li Xian was in this thing, the more uncertain he felt. He was the emperor and the world was his. If he took a fancy to his treasure, should he give it to him or not? He looked for a while and finally could not help but squat down and said, "Have you seen enough? If you have, give it back to me." Yang Fu squatted on the other side and was scaling a fish in his hand. He had just heard the beautiful sister and his sister's martial uncle mention the two words, Li Han. In this world there were three people he was most afraid of. One was his second brother, another was his sister's martial uncle, and the last one was his sister. Of course, he was afraid of his royal sister because he didn't want his royal sister to be sad. He was afraid of his second royal brother because his second royal brother had killed his father and mother, as well as his eldest royal brother. If he went back, his second royal brother would kill him. He was afraid of his royal sister's martial uncle because he had locked him in a dark room to calculate problems and didn't even give him food. But if he had to say the person he hated the most, it was definitely Li Han. Although he had never seen Li Han and did not even know what he looked like, how good he was at playing marbles, or whether he could urinate as far as he could. But these were not important. What was important was that whether it was Prime Minister Wang or his sister, they always compared him with Li Han, saying how powerful and outstanding Li Han was. In comparison, Yang Fu was like an idiot, so he hated Li Han. He did not like anyone or anything related to Li Han. Therefore, when he found out that the beautiful and gentle sister was Li Han's sister, he did not think she was beautiful or gentle. He touched his chest. There was a snake sewn from a piece of cloth. Fat Tiger had lent it to him to play with. They often used this thing to scare girls. Girls were all afraid of snakes, and Li Han's sister was no exception. She looked even prettier than Fat Tiger's sister, Fat Ya, and looked even more gentle than Fat Ya. When she talked to his sister's martial uncle, even her eyes were smiling. She must be more afraid of snakes than Fat Ya. In the past few months he had already understood that as long as Fat Tiger and the others could do it, he could do it. Using a fake snake to scare girls wouldn't be punished. While Li Han's sister was washing her hands at the stream, Yang Fu quietly followed behind and threw the fake snake into the grass at her feet. He pointed at the grass and said loudly, "Snake, there's a snake." Shanning had squatted down to wash her hands by the stream, but she seemed to be startled by the sound. She waved her hand randomly in the grass beside her, grabbed something and threw it out. Yang Fu was indeed startled when he saw Li Han's sister. He laughed loudly and caught the fake snake, saying loudly, "Coward, that's fake. Are you talking about this?" Yang Fu saw the girl standing by the stream and turned around. She held something in her hand and waved it in front of his eyes. He saw clearly that it was the fake snake he had just thrown. If she was holding the fake snake, then what was the slippery, long, soft and moving thing in his hand? Li Yi was roasting Shanning's favorite mushrooms when he suddenly heard a scream from the stream. When he turned his head, he saw Yang Fu running over from there, his pants wet. His face was pale and he shouted as he ran, "Snake, there's a snake." Yang Fu, who often used fake snakes to scare girls with Fat Tiger, would actually be scared by snakes. Li Yi shook his head and looked at Shanning, who was walking over from the stream. He seemed to understand something. After learning martial arts from Emmingzu for 2 years, she was no longer the girl who would be scared by things like mice and snakes 2 years ago. Even Yongning was not afraid of these things. He had found the wrong person this time. Shanning walked over and looked at him with some grievance. She said, "Sir, there was a snake in the grass. I didn't know he was so easily scared. He was so scared by a snake that he peed his pants." Forget it, forget it. It's not the first time he peed his pants." Li Yi waved his hand and handed over the roasted mushrooms. He said, "Try it." "Thank you, sir." She reached out to take it and used chopsticks to feed Li Yi a piece before eating it herself. Not far away, Yang Fu, who had already changed into a pair of pants, looked over with fear in his eyes. She was so beautiful, looked so gentle and smiled so sweetly. She wasn't afraid of snakes. She actually used snakes to scare him. Her gentleness was fake and her smile was fake. It was all fake. He finally understood a principle. He couldn't provoke anyone around his royal sister and martial uncle. Shanning had been by his side for the past few days, and Li Yi hadn't seen Yang Fu for a few days. Of course it wasn't just Shanning. Li Xian had also been inseparable from him these past few days. Li Xian had never been to Shuzhou, but he had been heading west from the capital. He knew that the further west he went, the more desolate it was. Only when he reached the westernmost Shuzhou was everything different. Although the construction of the city couldn't be compared to the capital, in terms of commercial prosperity, the current Shuzhou couldn't even be compared to the capital. Other than here, there was no place like the Jing Kingdom, Qi Kingdom, Zhao Kingdom, and Wu Kingdom that allowed free trade like Shuzhou. Especially after seeing the shopping mall that Li Yi had described to him in the letter at the West Gate, Li Xian knew what kind of place Shuzhou would become in the future. The two of them climbed up the city wall and looked down at the bustling crowd below. Looking at Li Xian's expression, Li Yi casually asked, "Do you regret it?" "I don't regret it." Li Xian shook his head and said, "If I hadn't promised you this back then, there wouldn't be Shuzhou today." He suddenly looked at Li Yi and asked curiously, "If you were to govern the Jing Kingdom in 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, what would the Jing Kingdom look like?" If it wasn't in public, Li Yi had the urge to kick Li Xian off the wall. Their family had already lost Emmingzu, and Li Xian still wanted to do something to him. Was he worthy of the departed former emperor? Chapter 1063. The previous emperor was wise throughout his life, but the biggest mistake he made was to pass the throne to a fellow who was always thinking of pushing the empire away. You should give up on that thought. This was Shuzhou. Li did not have to give him face. He said without any room for negotiation. Are you going to stay here for the rest of your life? Li Xian was not angry at all. He looked at him and asked, are you not going to return to the capital? Not going back. Shuzhou was a beautiful place with beautiful mountains and clear waters. Its geographical location was unique. Why would he go back to the capital? If he went back to the capital, he would encounter all sorts of disgusting things. Li Xian asked again, do you want Emingzu to spend the rest of her life alone in the capital? Li Xian's words were getting more and more hurtful. This was also the reason why Li Yi did not want to bring him along. Why do you think she doesn't want to come here? Li Xian glared at him and said, even I know that she doesn't want to come here because she is afraid that once she comes here, she will never want to go back. Li Yi could not answer him. Emingzu even gave you her hair. How dare you say you don't want to go back to the capital? Li Xian looked at him and shook his head. You heartless man. Young master, first Miss asked me to call you back to eat. Fang stood on the city wall and looked at them. He did not finish his sentence and turned around to go down the city wall. Li Yi sighed. Li Xian did not understand Emingzu. The Jing kingdom could not do without her. Li Xian could travel thousands of miles from the capital to Shuzhou because of a sudden thought, but she would not. She could not let go of things that Li Xian could easily let go of. She was more like an emperor than Li Xian. When Li Xian arrived at Shuzhou, he found everything new and interesting. He was even more fascinated by the industrial base in the depths of the fringe. However, Drunk Mo's due date was approaching, and Li Yi had no time to accompany him, so he had to ask Wang Wei to send someone to pick him up. So far, it was still in the early stages, and the more mature ones were probably smelting and forging. As for the chemical industry, he only dabbled in it. Some time ago he made a match, but it was the most primitive and simple. It was not very safe and it was still being tested and improved. In a short period of time, it was impossible to put it into production. Fang's box was just for fun. He just wanted to show off in front of Li Xian. Li Xian stayed there for 7 days. When he came back, he was a little different. His reaction was also within Li Yi's expectations. The Academy of Science mainly focused on theoretical research. Improving farming tools, grinding lenses, inventing some ingenious gadgets, making a model of the solar system and so on. It could only be considered as a small-scale project. The shock brought about by these things was far less than seeing a cannon destroy a building 2 kilometers away. In comparison, what Li Xian did in the Academy of Science was almost like playing house. He sat next to him and looked at him with a strange look for a long time. Li Yi sighed and said, don't look at me like that. This thing is too heavy. If you want to carry it back, it will be time-consuming and laborious. Moreover, the research has not been completed and a lot of experiments have to be carried out. Even if you bring it back, it will only be a semi-finished product. There is no need to waste so much effort. Yang Liuqing walked into the room with a pile of clothes and soon came out again. He said, Uncle Master, I have put your clothes in the room. She was the princess with the least airs of a princess. In order to learn from a master, she put down her pride and became a servant in the Li family for a few months. She served tea, swept the floor and did the laundry. She took all of Xiao Huan's work, and Xiao Huan complained to him many times. Now that she had regained her identity, she still did not put on airs. Everything was almost exactly the same as before. Li Xian did not continue the topic of the red barbarian cannon. He looked at Yang Liuqing, who was walking out of the courtyard, and asked, is this the princess disciple of your second miss? Li Yi nodded. Li Xian thought for a while, looked at him and asked, do you accept her? Li Yi asked doubtfully, accept what? Accept her. Li Xian had really changed. Back then, he had confidently told him that he would only love the empress in this life. In the end, not long after he left, there was an imperial concubine in the palace. In the blink of an eye, he had slapped his own face. A while ago he was still calling him Brother Shin, and not long after he slept with his own brother. To be friends with this kind of person, one had to be on tenterhooks all the time. Accept her as a concubine? What concubine? That was Mississippi Lu's disciple, his martial nephew. Wasn't this the same as messing around? Xiao Huan was already 19 and she was Rui's servant girl. It was impossible for her to marry someone else. Rui had reminded him many times, but he still could not lay his hands on this adorable little girl. Li Xian still wanted to cause trouble for him. Li Xian took a sip of tea and asked, "Are you not going to help her?" "Oh. The red barbarian cannon will blast all the way. The Wu Kingdom does not even have Tianfa. Which city can stop that thing?" Li Xian still could not forget about the red barbarian cannon. Li Yi thought for a while and said, "Why don't you lend me 100,000 soldiers, and I will give you the red barbarian cannon. We can flatten the Wu Kingdom." Li Xian felt a little regretful and said, "This is a good idea." Unfortunately, if we really do this, the Wu Kingdom will no longer be called the Wu Kingdom. The Jing Kingdom today could not be compared to 5 or 6 years ago, especially in terms of military strength. If it was not for the fact that Li Xian and the court officials did not have any intention of expanding their territory, this would be the best time to make the Wu Kingdom change its surname. With 100,000 soldiers, Tianfa and the cannon, it was enough to flatten the Wu Kingdom. However, this was definitely not what Yang Liuqing wanted. She had never mentioned revenge to him. Li Yi knew that she was struggling and hesitating in her heart. Sometimes he could not bear it. As a woman, she carried too many things on her shoulders. However, it was not easy to let go of her parents' vengeance. He could only sigh. This decision was too important. Even he could not make it easily. In a room somewhere, Yang Fu put down his pen and said, "Prime Minister, I finished today's homework. I'm going out to play." Prime Minister Wang walked up to him. After checking, he corrected a few mistakes for him. Then he nodded and said, "Go." It was not until Yang Fu ran out of the room that he sat down at the table and looked out of the door. Her Highness had completed her homework very well. A few small mistakes did not matter. In the past, if Her Highness could calm down and finish her homework, he would definitely be overjoyed and would give her a lot of encouragement. However, King Jing, who was about to turn 15, had a lot of important things to do. He could not let others supervise his homework forever. These days, the faith in his heart that had never been shaken had been shaken many times. "Prime Minister." Yang Liuqing walked in from outside the door. Prime Minister Wang stood up and bowed to her. Then he thought of something and asked, "Your Highness, do you know who the young man who has been with Jianghu of Silla these days is?" He was a little confused. He had been observing Jianghu of Silla for a long time. Jianghu of Silla was the ruler of Shuzhou. When others talked to him, they would be respectful. No one was like that young man who was casual and unrestrained. Also, Jianghu of Silla treated him very differently from others. "Li Xian," Yang Liuqing said. "Li Xian." Prime Minister Wang thought about this name. He felt it was a little familiar, as if he had heard it somewhere. Seeing his confused expression, Yang Liuqing added, "He is the current emperor of the Jing Kingdom." In fact, there was no need for her to add. Old Minister Wang had already remembered. Wasn't the young emperor of the Jing Kingdom called Li Xian? He had a shocked expression on his face. He stood up and said in disbelief, "He is the emperor of the Jing Kingdom. How could he leave the capital and come to a place so far away from Shuzhou? What about the court? How could the officials agree to it?" Yang Liuqing shook her head. She and Li Xian only knew each other. She did not know about these things. Old Minister Wang sat back down. He stroked his beard with a blank expression on his face. He felt like he had grasped something, but it also seemed like he had grasped nothing. But in the end, something was quietly growing in his heart. Chapter 1064. Li Yi realized that Old Man Wang, who was by Yang Liuqing's side, had been asking him more and more frequently. In the past, 90% of the questions he asked were about the difficult problems in the book, Elementary Mathematics. Recently, he didn't ask about these anymore. Instead, he asked about some reform matters in the Jing Kingdom. The Jing Kingdom had been carrying out reforms in the past few years. Some succeeded, some failed, but in general, the reforms were still developing in a good direction. Now, the court had found a long-term path that could stabilize the strength of the various classes and improve the lives of the people at the bottom. It was suitable for the development of the Jing Kingdom. It wasn't difficult for other countries to know the specific measures of these reforms. They could send some spies to live in the capital for a year and a half, and they could personally and deeply experience all the changes brought about by the reforms. Of course, Old Man Wang had been on the run with Yang Liuqing. Every day he would think about how to avoid the pursuit of the court of the Wu Kingdom and how to restore the dynasty. He didn't have the time or energy to investigate these things. If he was willing to investigate, these were not secrets. Therefore, when Li Yi was free, he wouldn't deliberately avoid this topic. Old Man Wang asked a few questions, stroked his beard and asked, I heard that other than the East Palace, there is also a West Palace in your country? The West Palace that Old Man Wang mentioned wasn't referring to the harem in the usual sense, but Mingzhu's Morning Dew Hall. At the beginning of the 5th year of Jianghu, the previous emperor was gravely ill. As the crown prince, Li Xian took charge of the government and entered the Eastern Palace. Although Mingzhu was the assistant, Li Xian's position was only a pretense. All the matters of the court, big or small, were actually all decided by Mingzhu alone. Gradually, no matter if it was the officials of the court or the common people of the capital, they all got used to calling the place she lived in Western Palace. This habit had been used until now. Li Xian devoted himself to scientific research and didn't care about the court affairs. In name, Mingzhu was an assistant, but she exercised the power of the court. Therefore the name West Palace became even more famous. There was no need to hide this from Old Man Wang. However, after he heard it, he seemed to be in a trance. He kept muttering, how can this be, and how can this be? Then he left in a daze. Li Yi shook his head. Old Man Wang had always wanted to help the Yangliuking siblings restore the dynasty, but now the hope was actually very slim. The old man was already old, and whether or not he could withstand this blow depended on his own willpower. He didn't think about it anymore. Drunk Mo would give birth at the end of this month, or at the beginning of next month at the latest. Other than this matter, everything else was a small matter. When the old man surnamed Wang walked into a study, Jianghu was holding a book and shaking his head. Seeing him walk in, he hurriedly said, Prime Minister, I'm going to memorize it soon. Give me another 15 minutes, just 15 minutes. The old man surnamed Wang stood at the door and looked at Jianghu with cloudy eyes. He stared at Jianghu for a long time, making Jianghu feel weak. He said with a sad face, I just secretly played for a while. Prime Minister, don't be angry. I'll memorize it right away, right away. The old man surnamed Wang walked over, shook his head and said, Your Highness, you don't have to memorize these things anymore. Jianghu's body stiffened, and then his face became even paler. He sat on the ground and hugged the leg of the old man surnamed Wang. Tears and snot flowed down his face as he cried, Prime Minister, I beg you, don't tell my sister, don't tell that person. I won't be lazy anymore, I won't be lazy anymore. The old man surnamed Wang bowed down and helped him up. He shook his head and said, These things are not what your Highness should learn. From today onwards I will teach your Highness something new. Jianghu wiped his tears, felt a little relieved and stood up from the ground. The old man looked at him and asked softly, Your Highness, do you still remember what your Highness' mission was? I remember. Jianghu wiped his snot and said, To overthrow that traitor who killed his brother and father, and to save the millions of people who are in dire straits. The old man nodded and said, Your Highness is the future emperor. To be an emperor, one man is the sky with great power to judge the situation, to make the best use of everything, to make the best use of people, to have a broad heart to accommodate the world, to have a broad mind to accommodate all rivers. To be an emperor, you don't have to be knowledgeable, you don't have to be able to compose good poems, you don't have to be able to write beautiful essays, but you can't lack the spirit of an emperor. Jianghu didn't really understand, but he still kept nodding his head. This is the way of an emperor. The old man pulled him to sit down at the table and said, This is what the previous emperor should have taught your Highness. Now that the previous emperor is gone, this old subject can only overstep his boundaries. The old man pressed his 2 hands on his shoulders, and with a solemn and respectful expression, he said in a serious tone, Your Highness King Jing, you have to grow up quickly. Jianghu could only nod his head. I hope that your Highness will listen carefully to what this old subject is going to say next, and remember it. The old man stood up and said slowly, The way of a ruler is to retreat and think of treasures. Don't worry about your own affairs, and you know your own blessings and blessings. Jianghu nodded his head and listened carefully. Gradually, the frequency of his nodding began to slow down, slower and slower. This subject does not need to be domineering, do not need to be greedy, follow the emperor's instructions. The voice of the old man with the surname Wang gradually became softer. He looked down at King Jing, who was lying on the table blowing bubbles with his snot, and sat down at the table opposite him. He looked at Jianghu, who was sleeping soundly without any expression on his face. He was motionless like a dead tree, a stone tablet. The days in Shuzhou were actually quite boring. Li Yi yearned for days where he didn't need to worry about anything. He could eat and sleep and occasionally bask in the sun when the weather was good. But if he lived like this every day, wouldn't he be bored to death? In the past, he could still tease Mississippi Lou when he had nothing to do, and add some fun to his dull life. But now Rui had become gentle and she didn't fight with him anymore. No matter what he did, she would just laugh it off. The last bit of fun in his life was gone. Fortunately, Shanning had been staying by his side these days. In the past, she was always mischievous and always had some strange ideas. Although she was a little naughty, it was still a young girl's nature. Now she was like a completely different person. After not seeing her for 2 years, she already had the gentle temperament of a noble. However, whether it was the old Shanning or the current Shanning, she made people feel happy just by looking at her. As long as she was by his side, his mood would be inexplicably better. This time, when Li Xian went out incognito, many experts from the palace were deployed. Some followed him to the land of chaos, and a few stayed behind to protect Shanning. An old nanny followed Shanning closely, but Mississippi Lou felt that the old nanny was not strong enough, so she asked Bai Su to follow her closely to ensure her safety. These few days she and Bai Su, who had no breasts, no buttocks and liked women, had gotten to know each other. In the small courtyard, Shanning held a long sword in her hand, and Bai Su only held a willow branch in his hand, helping her to practice. Shanning had been practicing martial arts for 2 years. With Mingzhu's guidance and the countless books in the palace, 2 years of practicing martial arts was equivalent to 10 years of practice for others. Although she still couldn't make it into the heaven and earth role, she could be considered as a minor expert. Of course, she was still far from the Bai Su who had no breasts and no buttocks, but was ranked 8th on the heaven roll. That's right, just 2 days ago Bai Su had defeated the original 8th on the heaven roll and replaced him. Li Yi felt it was a pity. Although Bai Su's figure was a little flat, she was still pretty. How could she fall in love with a woman? She was so nice to Shanning, so Li Yi was a little worried. Could it be that she had feelings for Shanning? She was only 16, just a child. Women were always very sensitive to men's gazes. Therefore, when Bai Su noticed that Li Yi had been sizing her up for a long time, she stopped feeding Shanning, turned to look at him and said, "Your Highness Jianghu of Silla, if you're interested, why don't you come up and have a spar?" Li Yi shook his head without hesitation. There was no need for a spar. With Bai Su, his image as an idol had long collapsed. She just wanted to take revenge on him for patting her chest and stealing her woman. Bai Su glanced at him with disdain, walked forward, picked up the teapot and gulped down a few mouthfuls. Li Yi watched her put down the teapot and thought to himself that an expert was indeed an expert. Even drinking tea so boldly, he thought about it and asked curiously, "Miss Bai, you're not young anymore. Haven't you thought of finding someone to start a family with?" Thinking of this, Bai Su's heart was a little angry again and she glared at him. Li Yi sat a little further away and said, "Don't look at me like that, we're not suitable." Bai Su clenched her fists and her chest rose and fell a few times. Suddenly she smiled and asked, "In the Jianghu of Silla family, does anyone use lily-flavored perfume?" "No." Li Yi shook his head. Ever since Zuemo got pregnant, no one in the residence, from the master to the servant girls, used perfume. Bai Su suddenly walked forward and gave him a gentle hug. With a smile on her face she said softly, "Thank you for your concern, Your Highness Jianghu of Silla. I will consider what you said carefully." Li Yi was stunned. He just said it casually just now, he didn't expect Bai Su to really consider it. He suddenly felt a little guilty in his heart. From now on, in this world, he was afraid that there would be another man who would suffer. Then he seemed to think of something and looked at her and asked, "What did you say just now, what lily-flavored perfume?" "Nothing, just casually asking." Bai Su smiled, walked into the courtyard and said to Shanning, "Let's continue." Inexplicable. Li Yi shook his head, stood up and walked into the courtyard inside. Zuemo should be giving birth in a few days. Rui, Ruoqing, Yang Liuqing and 3rd Miss Chen were all in the courtyard. "Stop." He walked over and said a few words. When he was about to walk back to the study, he was stopped by Rui. Rui walked over and walked to his side. She frowned and murmured, "Lily-flavored perfume." Li Yi was stunned. When he raised his head, he saw 5 pairs of eyes in front of him looking over. "You're tuning in to the Han Li's Wuxia Adventures YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.